helpful, I will open it up for any questions on those. And again, these are just draft comments. We will receive official comments once this goes through the planning board.
Thank you very much, Mr. PreK. If there's, does anyone else have any questions for him? No? If there are no further questions, I will now entertain a motion to approve the Cycle 39 water supply and sewage master plan amendments.
Be it moved that the Baltimore County Planning Board adopt staff recommendations and reports for the water and sewage plan amendment cycle 39 as discussed.
Second?
Second.
All in favor?
Hold up, Nancy. There's 3 different options there. We have to know what your option based on the staff report. If you look at the action summaries, there's 3 different recommendations that were made in the staff report. So you guys have to decide which way you want to go.
Crystal, can you please read the 3 different options? Are they too long?
There were 3 different recommendations. One was from Public Works and Transportation to do W3 capital facilities area. Sewer designation is deferred. They deferred sewer designation to EPS and planning. Option B was made by Environmental Protection and Sustainability for W3 S3. And then option C was which Department of Planning made, which was no change to the water and sewer designations. We provided you with all 3 options that were shown in the Public Works staff report.
I would make the motion to accept the Public Works one.
All right, has everyone had an opportunity to read the 3 different options?
So let me amend my motion then.
Thank you.
Be it moved that the Baltimore County Planning Board adopt staff recommendation and reports for the water and sewage plan amendment cycle 39, reference number 2101, to designate as W3 capital facilities area. Sewer designation is deferred to EPS and planning to be forwarded to the Baltimore County Council.
Okay, do I have a second for that motion?
I'm sorry to interrupt, but we will still need to know which sewer, because planning had a different sewer designation we recommended and environmental had a different one.
Yeah, I thought I made a motion that we use the Public Works one. That
Right. So I think that the challenge is the Public Works didn't designate the sewer.
I thought Public Works was the same as the sewer. The sewer and the Public Works had done this. There was 2 that were the same, and then ours planning was different.
Right. Well, so the way that I'm reading this is Public Works had set it as a W3 for the water, deferred to EPS for the sewer. EPS has a W3 for the water and an S3 for the sewer. And planning proposed a W567 and S567. So Todd, I think what you're proposing is the W3 S3 recommendation, which is the combination of Public Works and EPS.
Yes.
Is it possible that we show the different options on the screen that was asked by a board member, please? If not, what we can do is entertain Mr. Warren's motion. And if the rest of the board is not prepared to make a motion on that this evening, Mr. Lafferty, would we be able to table this until the board has time to review the three different options?
Yes, Madam Chair, the board could table the motion until the next regularly scheduled meeting.
Okay. So since Mr. Warren does have a motion on the table, do we have a second for Mr. Warren's motion?
I'm okay with tabling it if people don't understand, I don't want to vote on something, so I'm okay with tabling.
So are you changing your motion, Mr. Warren?
I will make a motion to table the discussion until we can have further information.
Okay. Is there a second on that motion?
Yeah, I'll second that.
All in favor?
Aye.
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 Okay.
I can
Thank you.
share the appropriate material. Do we not want to share it? It's up to you.
For tabled.
It's
I-
been tabled now.
Yeah, I think Crystal we'll take this, and then everyone will have an opportunity to look over it for our next meeting. And then please, board members, come prepared to vote on it for our next meeting.
If I can ask Mr. Boki a question, Madam Chair?
Please, Mr. Lafferty, go ahead.
Yeah, I just, Brian, does tabling present any particular challenge for the department needing to advance this matter? If it's tabled
No,
till the next meeting, which is September 23rd.
Yes, that'll be no issue from our department.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
Thank you. And please let me know if any questions come up as you review this material.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Brokey, for your time. Okay, moving on. We have a special presentation by Paul Mills from Canon Designs, consultant to Baltimore County on the multi-year improvement plan for all schools, commonly referred to as MyPass. At the January 26, 2021 Planning Board meeting, Mr. Mills delivered an initial presentation on the scope of work Canon Design is providing to Baltimore County on the multi-year improvement plan for all schools. Since January, Canon Design has moved into phase 2 of this project and is here today to update us on their progress. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Mills.
Madam Chair, if I may, I believe that either Samantha O'Neill or Jennifer Lynch from the County Executive's Office also wanted to make a couple of comments or to introduce this, if you don't mind.
Not at all.
And I'm not sure if it's Sam or Jen.
Thanks, Director Lafferty. Thank you, Madam Chair. For those who don't know me, I am Sam O'Neill. I serve as the Senior Advisor to the County Executive. My colleague, Dr. Jennifer Lynch, is on the call. And Jen, I know that Madam Chair did a great job introducing the concept and sort of the update, but I'd love for you to just provide a couple of comments on the importance of this project on behalf of the county, if you don't mind, before we give it over to Paul.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, everybody, for allowing us to be here today. As you know, the multi-year improvement plan for all schools has been underway. The research and the planning has been underway for well over a year now, close to 2 years. And the plan has developed a prioritized list of all capital planning needs in Baltimore County public schools and their facilities. It has identified over $4 billion of capital construction needs, and then has taken those needs and has placed them into our available budget of $2.5 billion. And so with the strong work of Canon Design, they have been able to prioritize and to develop a plan that will allow us to effectively address all capital needs in Baltimore County, address overcrowding and seat capacity needs, as well as start to shift from a system that we've had of only addressing our most critical problems to also developing a more proactive plan to make sure that we are touching all of our schools within 15 years to provide necessary upgrades, to make sure that we are getting ahead of our capital planning so that we don't end up with dilapidated or overcrowding buildings as has been the plan in the past. So the work has been ongoing. It's been very comprehensive. The work of Canon Design has included multiple phases and stages that has included input from Baltimore County Public Schools, personnel, from our public, from stakeholder groups. There have been surveys and community forums. It has really been a co-constructed capital planning list, taking into consideration multiple data points as well as input from our communities so that it really does meet the needs and is reflective of what Baltimore County needs moving forward. Sam, is there anything else that you want to add before I kick this over to Mr. Mills and Mr. Lever and Dr.
I think that was perfect, Jen. Thank you.
All right. So we have on the phone with us today, we have Paul Mills and Dr. Lever, who are the project leads, and I will let them take it away.
Fantastic. Thanks for the introduction, and you really hit the high points of what we're going to present. What you had advanced copy of as PDF format is a little longer than what we will be presenting today. We've kind of skimmed it down to really hit the high points. So we leave enough time for some Q&A at the end of this. So we might see some slides, or we'll skip some slides that you might have in front of you in your electronic copy of it. I'm Paul Mills with Canon Design in partnership with Educational Facilities Planning, otherwise known as Dr. David Lever. We're here and we've enjoyed this process and look forward to sharing this content with you. So just a quick recap of purpose of the intent of this project that was summarized just a moment ago. Really, it's about creating a roadmap for your capital improvements programs for your school, predictable and driven by data at the foundation, with the goal of maximizing state funding as part of it. It's a comprehensive study in which we look not just at the capacity or just at the condition. We also added to those updated studies a measure of all the educational adequacy and equity of the facilities across the entire county. As mentioned before, it did include a very overt, even despite the pandemic, very overt program of outreach and participation of community members that ranges from students, very importantly, from teachers, parents, community members, business leaders, et cetera, who've engaged in part of this process. And finally, at the end there, it's really driven with the notion that there's a priority on allocating resources in an equitable manner. Here we go. So just a quick point of comparison, just in terms of what this is compared to perhaps other studies that could be easily conflated with it, just by the notion that there are various studies that happen across the entire cycle of a capital planning process. Starting at the very beginning, like this is, the multi-year improvement plan for all schools is a long-range planning exercise where we're looking forward. In our case, we're looking at a 15-year planning horizon as part of this, and you ask the sorts of questions at that point of how we would strategically invest limited budgets across all schools, considering all their various needs and limited resources in an equitable, reasonable time frame. There are other types of studies that happen a little bit later in this process, and we're recommending some of these as the work continues and the program continues, and that would be focused due diligence that are focusing on specific sites, looking at things like perhaps the notion of needing to acquire land or to do educational programming, what sorts of educational pedagogies and content curriculum are aspired, as well as more in-depth community outreach as part of a very strategic, important sorts of decisions that need to be made. There's also sorts of studies that happen later in the process, some of which are very present at the moment, but there are funding processes that require some administrative studies that are out there, such as what capital F, capital S, a feasibility study that's required to address very specific questions, such as the case of a couple of high schools in your county that have been under consideration for replacement, but it's an administrative requirement to do. It's a different type of study, a different sort of question. Ours looks at the needs of the entire county, whereas other ones are more focused on single sites and don't consider the needs of all the other schools in the entire county, nor does it consider the scarcity of resources that are available. There are other studies that are downstream of the work as well, when we get into the pre-design stages to really drill down on the actual scope of work that will design the processes for each school. So I'm not going to walk you through step by step what we did, but the numbers really tell the story that there was a very overt attempt to gain the perspectives and opinions of stakeholders with all the folks that I mentioned earlier. But there have been over 100 individuals that have not just attended one meeting and they're done, we call it outreach, but rather 100 members that have participated in an iterative planning process that was structured, in which there were 22 planning workshops, 12 hours of community forums, 3 community surveys conducted, and a whole bunch of different series of options. We're really proud of the turnout, particularly on the surveys where well over 20,000 stakeholders across the county have weighed into this process. So the results of it. Well, there's 3 main themes that really jumped out when we looked at the results from the surveys that are out there. One is that equitable distribution of resources is really in the DNA of this process and really is a high priority. You can see here from this particular question about just the allocation of resources, should it benefit as many students as possible? And you can see from the graphic here how a great majority either strongly agree or agree that that is the way to go. Second takeaway was that the timeline for implementing projects needs to be reasonable. There's clearly people want the benefits from any sort of capital improvements to happen nearer rather than later. But when we ask the question within the construct of waiting for a replacement facility that has a very, very positive outcome at the end, that there was a tolerance that really trailed off around 15 years as part of it, with a great majority of 82% that prefer 15 years or less than that. When you were to logically compare that to, well, there's not even a replacement at the end, but it's just waiting for a renovation, you would think that the tolerance would be even less on that. But we've looked at the balance of needs and resources and targeted around a 15-year cycle, which, by the way, is consistent with a lot of funding refreshes of systemic replacements at schools driven by the state of Maryland, as well as it's around the life cycle time of or a little bit more than a student's pre-K through 12 experience within the school system. Third takeaway, we had this kind of prioritization question, which we asked the stakeholders to rank all these various priorities there, and we focused on the top 3 here as a matter of course that access to academic opportunities is really the number 1 priority here. And that every student, close second to it, is that every student should have a seat inside the building, meaning that capacity is really a pain point. We know that measurably through the assessments that were done. After that, safe, supportive environment, clearly a high priority. Now, the next one, the 4th one, with having the facility in top condition, doing all the maintenance and repair sorts of things, while critical, is secondary to those other things. So we really took that to heart. We're looking at all the different pathways moving forward as part of it. As a matter of point, I'm about to start talking about some dollars and numbers, and I want to make sure that it's really clear where these numbers come from and how we're stating them. But the estimates are based on facility assessments. We had teams of architects and engineers visit all the schools to look at the condition of all the various systems that comprise your buildings, as well as looking at the sorts of needs that are out there educationally, and also a benchmark comparison of supports for at-risk populations that are out there. So there's definitely an equity lens as a component of it. And the numbers are driven by a professional, consistent, industry standard approach to cost estimating. All the numbers we're going to state here are in today's dollars. We're doing that for simplicity because we don't know exactly when each and every project lands over time, and we don't want to overstate something that could be pushed up in the cycle or understate what could be pushed back in a way that would be inequitable to process. So we've normalized everything at today's dollars. However, we're not ignoring the fact that there is cost escalation over time for construction, and we've presumed that there is a baseline. We gave it an actual generous boost for our current year of 10% escalation, but a on out for the duration, an annual more or less 4% cost escalation as an assumption of capital costs. We're also presuming that budgets don't stay static at your current budgets today. If you're to look back 15 years ago, your capital budgets were much lower than they are today. And congruently, if you're going 15 years into the future, they're going to be higher as well. The square feet figures that we use for cost estimating are based on your local priorities, the way you build schools in Baltimore County. which exceeds the minimum requirements that the state requires and will fund. We do know that you have higher standards and higher priorities, and we've assumed that for cost estimating purposes. So at the end of the day, we talked about some of the numbers. I hope this is visible on the screen there, but certainly in the PDF. But you can visibly see here that the cost of doing all the most expensive capital options that were designed as or considered as part of this and as raised with heavy participation of stakeholders is approaching $5 billion, 4.7. And then you compare that to a 15-year expected budget that you would have of 2.5 billion. Clearly, there's a shortfall between the two. The 2.5 is the numbers add up like this, that traditionally you're on a trajectory of spending about 140 million on average per year. The majority of which comes from the county, but there is a significant participation from the state. Also, we're presuming that there is about 400 million of built to learn dollars, and we're understanding that there's actually, it might come in faster than 10 years that are on the books, which we're real excited about, which enables us to accelerate certain projects as part of our recommendations to you. So clearly, as the little line shows there, there's a shortfall. So what we did is we looked at things in terms of the incremental costs to achieve these mission critical goals. First of all, we have these different categories here, and a couple things I want to point out first. We made sure we didn't double count the costs at all. So things are looking at things incrementally. So if we're talking about an educational strategy project or what we're calling premium projects, it would be the surplus costs or the additional costs beyond what the base costs of doing renovations or additions would be. Another point, when we're talking about managed growth, and that's the capacity growth, keeping up with the crowding that you have in several of your schools, that when we're talking about those projects, that's just the addition part of it. We're also recommending renovations at those schools as well. So the budgets for those particular groups of schools is actually much larger than what would be described by the managed growth. So we categorize things so we could think across the entire county in terms of what's right for any students, right for all students, to look at the hierarchy of needs that are out there. So we have a class of projects that are underway, that there's already been capital investment towards the completion of it, whether it's in design or construction. And we called those legacy projects, right? These are the schools of our future. There's a replacement of Lansdowne High School and others that are already committed on the books and work already being done. And those we're recommending continue forward, carry those out to completion. And next category is managed growth. These are the addition sorts of projects that keep up with not just classroom capacity, but also looking at the core facilities to make sure that you have the right size cafeterias, et cetera. Educational strategy is, and we'll talk about the specifics of these in a little bit, but these are very specific strategies that need to be addressed head on and in a way that has a big overarching portfolio scale issue relative to the number of schools, the types of programs, et cetera. These would be new programs, perhaps grade reconfiguration, or even consolidation of schools as considered. Special education, alternative education, very vital programs. We know they're distinct, but we've wanted to elevate them in their own category here to shine the light on the high priority of these vital programs that are out there. But this would be capital improvements to support those and expanding those services to those programs. Renovations and enhancements are what the name would imply, but this is really taking care of the physical needs of the building systems, as well as not just fixing stuff, but adding and improving the educational supports so that you have what you need instructionally, and through, in the interest of equity, take care of all the facilities. We also know that there is yet to be determined exact outcomes for the Blueprint for Maryland's Future. Very exciting program to expand pre-K early education in the county. And we wanted to acknowledge that that's out there. We did a very early impact study. We believe it's somewhere around 1 year's worth of capital improvements of initial impact that you probably would perceive as part of that. We don't know when it's going to hit and what kind of magnitude, or if there's funding available for it. So we've treated it in a very specific way we'll describe in a moment. Then our last category here is premium projects. These are things that are that we would love to do if all the resources in the world were available to us, but that it's difficult to recommend in light of the scarcity of resources and all the magnitude of need that are out there. The sorts of things that would be to build additions at schools that have crowding when there's a neighboring school that has surplus capacity that could be addressed with a non-capital solution by moving boundaries or attendance boundaries as part of it. And other examples are complete demolition and replacement of schools instead of doing renovations and additions on them. So how do we close this gap, budget gap? There's really three main broad categories of the way to do it. One, you can take longer to pay it off and get it done. So it's just like taking a longer mortgage out. You could afford a little bit more house, or you can get a little bit more car if you have more payments to amortize it over time. But as we talked about earlier, your stakeholders have suggested that their patience is on the shorter end, and we're prescribing kind of what we believe is kind of the max reasonable time frame to be recommending capital projects. Another way is to dig deeper, find more money, use alternative funding sources out there. We're making recommendations that you explore public-private partnerships as a mechanism to perhaps close the gap, but that needs careful consideration of the cost of capital, et cetera. But to do all of these projects over time, you'd probably need to come up with another 80 million more per year when you're spending about 140 million per year. The reduction of scope really is the only other way to close the gap between extending time, coming up with more money, is really coming down with, okay, we reduce the scope. How do we come up with a more economical way and prioritize renovations in a way and improvements in a way that benefit the needs? So our recommendations. We looked at all the $4.7 billion worth of needs illustrated on the left, and we have drilled down and come up with a recommendable package that actually fits your 15-year budget of $2.5 billion. So key points of what our recommendation is: one, you can afford it; it's within your budget. It addresses needs at all schools within that 15-year horizon. Now, is it all priorities? No. It's a matter of economizing, prioritizing investments in a way, but it's done in a way that actually improves the conditions at all your facilities on a reasonable refresh cycle. All of the legacy projects are included in our recommendations, and additions and redistricting recommendations that we are putting forward that would bring you to the 2026-27 school years enrollment projections, which we've used as our baseline for target. That would get it down to 100% across the board, so you wouldn't have any schools that would be overcrowded by that sort of time frame. It also includes select educational strategy projects, which I'll describe in a minute, with improvements for special education, alternative education, and a significant $1.6 billion worth of renovation enhancement projects, which we'll describe in a little bit. And the way we've dealt with pre-K, with all the unknowns that are out there, and the presumption that it is around, with our early impact studies, is probably around a year's cycle of your capital improvements, that you work that into the prioritization. But what you do is you extend your program timeline by 1 year or so to be able to accommodate that, but still stick to the scopes of work that we're recommending, just working that new priority in there if and when that happens. And what, the part of our recommendations you can visually see here is that those premium projects are not included in our recommendations. So visually looking at all these projects across the map, every single school in the portfolio has at bare minimum a prioritized renovation associated with it. Now, clearly, your newer facilities that were built within the last several years recently would have a much smaller scope to it, and these would be taking care of the systemic repairs of building systems that would elapse over a 15-year age time frame. But in your older facilities, they'd be much beyond that and include a lot more enhancements to bring them up to today's standards, the way you would build them if they were new today. There's 3 to 5 new schools as part of this process, and the reason it's not specifically out there is we're recommending some further due diligence on some real critical decisions that are out there, and we'll describe those in a little bit. There's 5 replacement schools that are all from your slate of legacy projects. There's 28 addition renovation projects, 132 renovations, and perhaps some repurposed campuses I'll describe in a minute. Well, list of schools, and I'll pause here, and what I would suggest is you look at your PDF or do a quick screen capture here So if you have specific interests in schools, it'll enable me to move on in the presentation. And if you have any specific questions about a school, we can address them. And we did look at trade-offs as part of this. With scarcity sources scenarios, is a real hard call about how we would move forward on this and make our recommendations. But we're looking at if we're to do all those premium projects that were out there, what that would in effect do, it would eclipse what we're recommending for renovations at 90 campuses across the county. So that would push any sort of capital improvements that we would do at those at the scale we were recommending beyond the 15-year horizon. We're real happy to share is that this is in very close alignment with your community preferences as part of the survey. There's a survey with thousands of responses in which they were to measure their level of support for all the various options that were explored. And this wasn't a case where here's the plan, what do you think? It was you have option A, option B, option C sort of scenario. What we're recommending now is almost lockstep with just about every single cluster or geographical area, with one sole exception, and that's in the Delaney and Towson area, which, as most people know, were ones that had been under consideration prior to our study for replacements. And our recommendations are not to do those, and the preferences that were shown in the surveys are out here on the screen. And let me show you how to read what I've put on here. Where it's gray, those are votes from across the entire county. The ones that are in red are ones that anyone who associated with any of the high schools within the central region, their vote would be counted in the red bars there. So as you can see, there's actually an abundance of responses out of central, a large turnout from Delaney Towson. They're very organized. They used social media to get the word out, and they got a very healthy response out of that, proportionally much higher than other parts of the county. You can look at the comparison here. Option A was the additions renovations that we are recommending. And you can see proportionally the votes for that are lower than for option B to replace Delaney and Towson. However, it's not quite as dramatic as you might think in terms of overall totals here. If you look at kind of where I'm shaking my mouse right here versus right here. Also, you see the proportion of the votes locally there. It's clearly the folks that would benefit from that sort of outcome of a replaced school were voting in favor of that versus other parts of the county. We did look and disaggregate the data by the student voice, just looking at student responses, both from within central cluster as well as across the entire county. And it's interesting to note that the proportion is much more closer to the middle when you look at the preferences towards the addition renovation versus others. So clearly the adults have a different perspective than the students on the outcomes and recommendations we're putting forward. The only other area that we're saying is we're not recommending a clear cut, this is the way to go forward. We're recommending some further due diligence on the notion of option B for the Northeast area, which was a new Northeast high school, as opposed to option A, which would be to grow existing schools to include Perry Hall and others in that general area, which are among the largest high schools within the county. You can see here that there's a slight preference towards the addition renovations, mostly driven by those not affected by the decisions. And it's really close when you look at the black curves here, slight preference towards the additions as opposed to a new school. However, when we disaggregated it down even further to just the one school that would really significantly be impacted and one would grow to a large scale beyond what you traditionally see in Baltimore County, and that's Perry Hall High School, there's actually a preference for the new school. And what I'm hearing from that is, don't grow us any further. We're big enough. We're looking at that data, and our recommendations are that we need to go through further due diligence and study. However, the capacity issues are extreme and important there, and we need to come to some sort of conclusion soon. But to do exploration about the real estate availability in that general area, as well as the preferences of the types of programs that would go into a facility there, and further outreach into the community to make sure that that very critical decision of building a new senior high school, which only happens once generationally, is done with the proper modicum of responsibility. So what's included in this process? Quickly go through and describe it. Here's the list of legacy projects, and I'm going to presume that you're pretty familiar with all these projects here. So if you want to do a quick screen grab or look at your PDF, you can move forward with that. Managed growth, these are the schools where we're recommending additions and renovations. These are grouped by clusters geographically, and in many cases, we haven't nailed down exactly the number of seats at each school because we know that it'll take time to develop some of these projects. And we're saying perhaps like in the instance of Delaney, Lochraven, and Towson High School. In that area, there's probably, with your projected enrollment, about the need of about 500 additional seats among those. We could tell you today what we think is the best decision for how many seats at each one of those schools. However, by the time it takes to get those designed and built, it's probably better to take a new snapshot, particularly in light of the coronavirus little hiccup we're seeing in enrollment projections. We want to make sure that you're making those decisions at the time of implementation in a responsible way. So we've kind of clustered our recommendations around different groups of schools. Educational strategy, 328 million, some big decisions that need to be made. I mentioned the new high school in the Northeast as a potentiality or additions at your existing high schools. And our recommendation is to do that due diligence that I described earlier. Down in Sparrows Point, we have a very unique situation and inequitable situation across the whole county where you have a middle school and high school that occupy one campus and operate, very well, but they operate on one campus, and it's just unlike any other situation you have across the county. And there has been a preference lifted up by stakeholders, both community as well as internal folks, that they want to explore the notion of finding a new home for the middle school, which will help relieve the capacity crunch you have at the site, as well as create that distance to enable a lot of, to alleviate some of the social emotional learning challenges that are associated with mixing those two populations together. So we're recommending that, just like with the high school scenario, that some further due diligence be done to see what the preferences are of the communities, as well as look at available land down the area, which is difficult, but there are potential new developments down the horizon there to find out some solutions. So there are different scenarios that have been explored. Build a new middle school on new land. One is to build a new middle school on one of your two elementaries that are on the Sparrows Point Peninsula. And then the other school would be rebuilt larger to accommodate both of those school populations, which would enable the high school to be renovated at the end. There's several other program improvements categorically here. Looking at grade reconfiguration. We have a unique situation down between Norwood Elementary and Hollibird Middle, in which they operate on a different grade configuration. The schools are in very close proximity to each other. However, you have a pre-K through 3 program and a 4 through 8 middle school, which has kind of some challenges associated with accountability, as well as with preparedness of students, et cetera, and social emotional aspects. And there is a strong desire by stakeholders directly affected by it, measurably from our surveys that are done, to rectify that. So what we're suggesting there is that some additions be accomplished at Norwood to restore them back to a pre-K through 5, 6 through 8 model that's consistent with the entire county. There's expansion of elementary magnets is of interest, particularly at Cromwell Magnets, kind of a wait list program. And while that is in kind of the corner between central and northeast areas of the county, that there's a lot of capacity needs in that area. We're saying while we're growing with additions, just to accommodate growth, that we have a little bit increment more to be able to expand magnet offerings beyond just the immediate area, which will create more access and diversity as part of the outcomes. We're also recommending career tech education improvements across the county, and that needs to be done with a career tech ed master plan that goes deeper into it and looks at the types of pathways that are out there. We've done some mapping and studies. We know that geographically, it's really gone where the talent is available to teach the programs, but there is the need for some intentional programming and planning of where these programs would exist to create more equitable access. You also have 2 sites that are very specific, Eastern Tech, Western Tech, awesome programs that are kind of take care of your more southerly aspects of the county. However, in the northwest and central parts of the county, they don't have access to that sort of program without having to go great distances. So we have a healthy budget in there to accommodate that with an expansion on an existing campus, or perhaps even a standalone campus that could serve the northwest area. and we explored consolidation of some facilities. There are a couple of options that were explored. Now, while closing schools is a difficult thing to do, there are some cases where there are very smallish elementary schools in close proximity to each other. And while it'd be a great expense to replace them and be able to consolidate, we looked at the notion of perhaps that we do this through a cost neutral approach through a public-private partnership where you can surplus property that could generate revenue streams or generate land swaps that could, this gets a bit beyond the scale of doing a MyPass type plan. However, we're putting recommendations that at least be explored. We don't have a budget in there for the capital costs of doing this sort of thing, but rather that it be explored to look at cost neutral approaches towards it. Special education, alternative education, $71 million for enhancements across the county to address these vital programs that are out there. A couple of highlights about that is right now White Oak, the former White Oak Elementary School houses a special education center, very vital program that is in a larger facility than they necessarily need. And what we're recommending is that a special purpose built to suit facility be state of the art, built for that vital program, which would vacate that site, enable renovations to happen in a way that would fuel swing space that would help the rest of the renovations and capacity enhance in that general area across central and northeast to take place in a more efficient manner, saving you more money along the way and fueling better improvements in your classes. And I'm going to move on in the interest of time here. Low battery. I'm going to try to do that while we're speaking here. I mentioned pre-K earlier. What we're recommending is that be considered a time contingency, so that you take a little bit longer to amortize those priorities of projects instead of budgeting for it today, because we don't know yet if it's really going to be a capital hit that isn't unfunded, and that the extent and magnitude of it is really hazy at this point. So we're being responsible and recommending that we acknowledge it's out there and that we have a plan in place for it with triggers associated with it. Renovations and enhancements, this goes beyond just fixing maintenance type sorts of affairs. It gets into addressing educational needs. It levels the bar and get your older facilities closer to what you would build today. And the sorts of descriptors of the sorts of things that are out there are on the screen here as well. We did an assessment that measured all these, comparing the yardstick we used was comparing versus what you're building today in new schools at Towson, as well as Red House Run for elementary schools. Another important critical aspects of that work is that we had an equity component of this. In addition to the way we did it with a consistent standards-based approach, which has equity baked in just by the manner in which we did it, we also looked at your most vulnerable populations that are out there, looked at the indicators in data that would drive at the need for specific facility supports like we have here. And what we're recommending are shown illustrated where they would exist on the map. They would include things like laundry, shower, food pantry facilities to take care of the tragic scenarios where you have homeless students so that they could attend school in a way with dignity and with parity with their peers. It also includes childcare, early childhood education programs, kind of a double bottom line win, where you have enhancement of CTE opportunities, as well as address the needs for students that have children of their own. Supports for ELL students, community health facilities that we know in certain pockets of the community, parts of the county, a dearth of access to clinics and supports for health, that there's improvements involved in there. Spaces for social emotional learning, counseling, parent resource centers, reading and math resource, help level the playing field and close educational gaps. So that's my MyPass. At the end of the day, it's really about all schools, all students. We're recommending an equitable allocation of your foreseeable funding for 15 years across all of your facilities in a way that's very strategic and addresses the most benefit to the most students as possible. The next steps, where we are in this, and we're just about finished here. So we've presented these findings and our recommendations to the Board of Education and to County Council as a first read. And this is the extent of the detail that they've seen so far to date. We are in the middle of documenting this, dotting the I's, crossing the T's, and fleshing out all the details and sequencing of these projects. We're looking at the timeline. This kind of graphic here would illustrate how those different categories of projects might amortize across your available funding. And we're in the middle of cash flowing that out and figuring the best sequence. And it's really driven by the equitable approach of using the objective assessment measures that we did when I spoke to you before about the findings from our facility assessments, which basically asserts that those with higher need have higher priority and would be sequenced first. With that, we'll take any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Mills, for your very enlightening presentation there. Board members, do you have any questions?
I do, Madam Chairman.
Go ahead, please.
You know, you talk about redistricting. There might be no bigger issue that the members of our county, the people live in our county, will get up in arms about, as we see throughout the country, not just here in Maryland. So, you know, it's always very easy to suggest that. We know we have space in some schools and not in others, but, you know, just a very difficult way to proceed forward, I believe, you know, to try to convince people to change those boundaries. We always seem to hear, I've been on the planning board now, I think 12 years, that the numbers throughout the state, children are decreasing, number of children in families and all, but it never seems to affect, you know, the overcrowding that we seem to have in a lot of the schools. I understand that ties into redistricting as well. I know we have older schools that we have, you know, put into disservice and moved them to, you know, county recreation centers and all, so we have given up. But it does seem that we have, you know, built a lot of new elementary schools in the last 10 or so years. The state has, you know, projected that they're going to put a lot of money into new construction with, you know, with the new funding for all schools. That sounds great, but again, you know, they are very expensive to build a new school versus a renovation. And then I guess the real question is, you know, you've projected, and it's a little bit easy for you to say that the money will be there, but I think that you're going to see in the next 10 or 15 or 20 years, as we had to raise our taxes somewhat here in Baltimore County, that to pay for these new schools are our constituents, the people that live here in Baltimore County, which is now a minority county and an older county, going to be willing to put the money forth to build these new schools, whether renovating them or building new ones. You know, we talked about this last year with the capital budget. You know, it's easy to spend money on paper. Are our children very important? Absolutely. You talked about the pandemic. Some people have moved their children into parochial schools. Is that a good thing, a bad thing, or into private schools? You know, look, with the question of whether vouchers will ever come out from the state to help pay for that, then that will keep our numbers down, possibly, you know, in the county public school system. I mean, these are things that we all have heard about. I'm not saying anything that we don't know, but, you know, it's probably, you know, our Board of Public, I'm sorry, our Board of Education budgets are the largest part, of course, of our budgets, both capital and what we spend for the teachers that are, you know, very important as well. So, like I say, it's pretty easy to talk about it. I understand you've done a wonderful job, you know, presenting it to us and telling us what would be, you know, wonderful to have, but we do, bottom line, still have to figure out a way to pay for it. So,
Thank you, Mr. Perlow.
Yep.
Are there any other comments from the board?
Yes, Nancy. So Paul, first I want to thank you for this presentation and the detail provided. I have just a specific question for one school, which is Cromwell Valley Elementary. So I see there's a proposal to expand it, and I think it's about 100-seat addition. 7 years ago, there had been another proposal to add, I think it was about 300, a little under 300 seats. It got scaled back, and then it finally got killed. Part of the issue there, I think, was the lack of space for Cromwell. What is the what, if any, exploratory work has been done to kind of figure out the feasibility of expanding Cromwell or the cost efficiency of it?
Thanks for the question, Mr. Calgary. We didn't go visit the site and conduct a feasibility study. It's premature at this point. However, we consulted with staff familiar with the site and stakeholders familiar with the site, as well as, did our Googling to see how the site could accommodate it, looked at GIS documents for the topology, et cetera. It appears to be a feasible scenario to do, to expand it at that sort of scale that we're recommending.
Okay. So there will be a further study down the road before.
Certainly, as you get closer to implementation on the project, you'd have to have someone spend a little more time than we could afford to on this sort of study that looks at 170 sites.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Caligari. Any other questions?
Madam Chairman, can I ask
Madam
a question?
Chair.
Mr. Warren, Passaic.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
First of all, Paul, I want to say this was amazing. I mean, I think this is something the county should have done years and years and years ago. We would be in the situation we're in right now. So I'm very impressed by the level of detail you went into, especially looking at how we can be equitable across the whole county and not just focusing on certain areas. So very, very, very impressed by that. Can you talk to me a little bit about, I've done a little research since the last time we had you in to speak, and how the state looks at giving funds versus how, we may want to use the fund. So the terminology is built for learning. So I know there's a difference in how much money we would get for, let's say, a remodel versus a new school. Can you give us any insight into that and how that went into your planning on this?
Absolutely. I'm going to turn over to Dr. Lever, who I believe is still on the call. If you could unmute David and address that.
Yes. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Good. Thank you. Thanks for the question, Mr. Warren. The state will look at, for a major project, the school which is submitted, but they'll also look at adjacent schools. So if you're submitting for a project for capacity, to expand the capacity of an existing school, they'll look at the adjacent schools. And if there is capacity in those schools, state funding will be reduced or it might not be given at all. That goes back to that question that was asked earlier about redistricting. So that issue about redistricting can affect the whole goal of trying to maximize state funding. State funding for renovation, it depends partly on the age of the facility. If the facility is 40 years old, then the only difference will be in the allocation for the site work. For renovation, it's 5% of construction. For new construction, it's 19%. So you will see that differential, assuming that you would get full funding for a new facility. And then when it comes to very small projects, which are based really on kind of scoping studies, the kind that Paul was mentioning earlier, generally the state would fund based on the estimated cost. And that would be true for, say, an individual project like a roof replacement, a boiler replacement. But if you were doing something more complex, let's just say prioritize renovations within a school, not the complete renovation, but certain selected spaces, certain selected building systems, most likely the state participation would be based on the actual scope and the estimated costs. Does that help to answer the question, or are there other questions about how the state might fund? There are certain issues that are coming up, and I don't want to get into something we don't really know too much about, which is how the state intends to prioritize its funding once this facility assessment, which is underway right now, is completed, and a work group makes its recommendations. That'll be in December.
Well, I just want to say this is one of the best presentations. I've been on the planning board for over 8 years. Really great. I guess my last question, one of the things that bothered me the most when we met before was the Sparrows Point School needing was number one on the list of needs, and we were looking at doing schools that were number 6 on the list of needs. What about timing of this? So like how does this? And I know you talked a little bit about that, but how did we talk about this refresh 15-year window? How are we timing out these needs? Or prioritizatory? I can't say the word. Are we putting the schools first that need to have the greatest need from a timing standpoint? And that's
We're in the middle of doing that sequencing right now, but in general, within each category, it's driven by default by that priority need from the assessment. So it's very objective, and it's a measurable way to demonstrate that the higher the need, the higher the priority first. However, with the different categories are structured in a way, and we're scheduling those in a way that addresses what we professionally recommend, as well as what we're hearing from the community, such as capacity is way up towards the top of needs. We're putting those projects towards the front end of this horizon as quickly as we can get to them, while addressing your legacy projects as well, so that we can catch up with that crowding that's happening. And some of those educational strategy ones have certain timing aspects to them and sequence of when they need to happen. You mentioned Sparrows Point. Depending on which outcome or which preferred option is moved forward, there's definitely a domino effect of you've got to do X before Y before Z. And the sequence of time is such that we need to start on those on an earlier basis.
But we have, if I could add to that, we have tested this, and under the funding assumptions which Paul outlined earlier, we do think that all the projects can be completed within 15 years. But of course, they do depend on that funding set of assumptions.
Thank you, gentlemen. Does any of the other board members have questions?
Yes, Nancy,
Paul,
I do have a question.
Okay, I'm sorry. Ms. Wolfson, do you have a question?
Yes, I did. Sorry, Derek.
That's
I
no problem.
did want to applaud, Paul, your inclusion of food, laundry, and shower facilities in schools that are targeted. I represent the area along Liberty Road, and I hear over and over again how transience has impacted school performance. Much of Baltimore County's low-income housing has been clustered on that side. We have a real legacy problem there of transients and people that can't afford housing long-term. And I also know that transients doesn't only affect the students that are going in and out of the schools, but the children whose classes are disrupted by up to 30% turnover a year in those schools. So, I'm just very, very impressed that you have considered the needs of those students to help them be able to compete on more even footing with students who have a stable home environment.
Thank you, Ms. Wolfson. Mr. Johnson, you've been patiently waiting. Mr. Johnson.
Yes, ma'am. Mr. Mills, thank you so much for your presentation. I have just a quick question. I'm new to the planning board, but how many years ago was a study like this done? And my second question would be, is this your projections, I guess, contingent upon the same administration or the same, I guess, stakeholders being involved? Because, we know people change that are in leadership, and we're talking 15-year plan. Do you foresee it being any problems with down the road with funding, or maybe even the need for this?
Fantastic question. One of my favorite subjects, actually. When we do these plans, we do with our best foot forward, and we know that it's probably going to be a refresh of it and look at the enrollment projections in 5 years or so, and make sure that what we recommended back in 2021 still holds true at that point in time. So this is kind of a living, breathing, structured document. We've provided the county a lot of tools that could make the next process a little easier and quicker with all the facility assessment data that's provided out there. We have an inventory of facilities like the county's never had before, as well as some planning structures for how we looked at capacity, looked at equity and the adequacy of the facilities in a way that can be replicated rather quickly without having to go to the full investment that you had to make with this process here. I hope I addressed your question.
Thank you very much. Board members, any other questions? We have a big agenda tonight. If not, Mr. Mills, thank you very, very much. Mr. Lever, we appreciate you both taking the time this evening. It was extremely enlightening, and then we will move on now. Next on our agenda.
Madam Chair.
Yes.
Madam Chair, if I just may make a comment. First of all, once again, thanks to Paul and David, but more importantly, we wanted to share this amount of information with the planning board because throughout the entire master plan community engagement process, there's hardly anything that comes up more frequently or that's more important to communities and therefore to the planning efforts that we undertake than the schools. A lot of it is resource-based, not just the physical facilities. So to Ms. Wolfson's comment about these additional elements that make up community schools, it's again one of those factors that as we're not only developing the master plan, but looking at community plans going forward, the schools are going to continue to play a critical role. So having this amount of information available to you as planning board members and decision makers is going to be increasingly important for the work that we're doing. So that's why we were willing to take that much time. And the questions have been terrific, and I'm surely glad that everybody's been so engaged. So thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Lafferty, for your comments. That was a great ending for that discussion. All right. Moving on. Next on the agenda, we have a presentation from the Department of Planning led by Ms. Jennifer Nugent, Division Chief, Development Review on Resolution 46-21, Minimum Width Requirements for Townhouse Group Homes. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Nugent.
Thank you and good evening, Madam Chair. Bear with me one second. Okay. Can everybody see my screen and hear me okay?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
Resolution 4621 was a request enacted by the Baltimore County Council for the Planning Board to review the laws, regulations, and policies associated with the minimum width requirement of townhouses or group houses, study the feasibility and efficacy of amending the minimum width requirement, and to report its findings and recommendations on the results of its studies to the County Council. This request was proposed by the Baltimore County chapter of the Maryland Building Industry Association, or MBIA, as we will refer to it in this document, to the County Council. The Department of Planning conducted research and analysis over many weeks and prepared and provided to you ahead of this meeting its report on findings and recommendations for the Planning Board to consider for responding back to Council as requested in the resolution. In preparing this report, staff researched other jurisdictions' zoning codes and ordinances to compare and contrast permissible unit widths, analyzed approved developments within Baltimore County, and examined Baltimore County's existing regulations with regard to townhome width. Townhouse development in Baltimore County is permissible within the Erdl and Growth Tier 1, which is served by public water and sewer. The map that's showing on this slide in the yellow is all the area that resides within the Erdl and Growth Tier 1 generally. Townhouses are developable by right in the 10-5 and DR 10-5 and 16 zones. The DR 5-5 zone allows townhouses to be developed subject to a compatibility finding per the Baltimore County Code requirements. The CMDP establishes the minimum width requirement for townhouses at 20 feet wide. A townhouse less than 20 feet in width is permissible within a PUD development. Townhouse development proposed in Baltimore County is considered major development and requires full development plan review process in accordance with Article 32, Title 4, Subtitle 2 of the Baltimore County Code. The design of a townhouse development must also meet the requirements outlined in BCZR Section 1B01 and Section 260 of the zoning regulations as well, which refers to the residential performance standards. It also must meet the requirements found in Master Plan 2020, the Comprehensive Manual Development Policies, or CMDP, the Baltimore County Landscape Manual, and applicable community plans. Additionally, the Baltimore County Local Open Space Manual requires a provision of open space for major development based on the calculation of a minimum of 1,000 square feet per dwelling unit, which also must be provided for approval or must be met. The Department of Planning's research revealed that in the last 10 years, only 3 of 14 PUD developments approved in the county took advantage of the reduced townhouse width. 2 developments with reduced width from the 20-foot minimum are proximate to the Towson Urban Center, where commercial and office uses, as well as educational institutions, are within walking distance and making them desirable housing choices. The third PUD is located in the Dundalk community, but has not gone to construction. And we've circled those 2 areas on this map on this slide. Towson Green, located between Towson Town Boulevard and Burke Avenue, has a mix of 16, 18, and 20-foot wide townhouses with front and rear parking, central open spaces, and a tot lot. Average home prices range in the mid-400s in this development today. Towson Muse, located at the corner of Virginia and Pennsylvania Avenues, is a 34-unit PUD townhouse development improved in 2015. All units are 18 feet wide with 2-car rear-loaded garages. The average sale price in 2018 was in the mid-400s. Although no active open space is provided, its proximity to downtown Towson makes it a desirable and walkable community. What happens when you're reducing a townhouse width? By reducing the minimum required width of each unit from 20 feet to 16 or 18 feet, we did an analysis of some existing approved development plans and did 3 case studies that we provided in your report. Based on these case studies, by including in a reduced width townhouse unit, more dwelling units could be added to a development up to the maximum gross residential density. Adding more units at a reduced width, even though there is spare density, could potentially add more residents and therefore drive the demand for increased open space, landscaped areas, and parking, as well as increased traffic. These are critical features in establishing a vibrant community and are important elements in the design of the development. An analysis of the surrounding counties show that minimum housing widths range from 16 feet to 24 feet, as evidenced by this comparison chart of townhouse unit width that we've included with this slide. The Department of Planning's analysis indicates that in the 3 surrounding counties, Harford, Howard, and Anne Arundel, 16-foot wide townhouses are not permitted by right in any residential zone. Anne Arundel County permits 16-foot wide townhouses in residential zones as a conditional use, provided that certain regulations are met. While some of MBIA's financial analysis does highlight some added community benefits, like increasing housing choices and creating more socially and economically diverse communities, the department had difficulty in determining the financial gains and more affordable options as presented in MBIA's information. The lack of access to the construction price points for reduced width homes and the varying construction costs in certain areas, it is difficult to identify the financial benefit from reducing construction costs or making homes more affordable to more citizens, as the MBIA asserts. Numbers and price points given by MBIA and reflected in their analysis might not be entirely accurate. Home prices that were listed for specific developments that MBIA provided as examples in and around Baltimore County differed from the information provided on the websites advertising these homes for sale. The cost differential was advertised at a higher rate than stated by MBIA. MBIA was asked to provide comparative price points in jurisdictions where 16-foot wide townhomes are permitted and cost of construction per square foot, but this was not provided to the Department of Planning. The cost of market rate housing tends to fluctuate, and in the present economy, housing and supply and demand are driving home prices and costs. This is likely to change in the coming years. MBIA also asserts that reducing the width of the townhouses could be offset by making lots deeper and the homes longer, and by adding additional floors to accommodate the reduced width. This argument seems counter to reducing the prices, since if a house is narrower but longer, an additional floor were to be added to keep the same amenities, costs could stay the same. Housing is one of the crucial components for economic growth and the backbone of strong communities. With regard to the countywide enterprise strategic plan outlined by the administration, it plays a critical role in achieving 4 of the set goals: vibrant communities, sustainability, equity, and education. By establishing the minimum 20-foot width for townhouses in Baltimore County in the CMDP, the county was clear in its intent to build homes to address the minimum needs of residents who desire to live in a single-family home with reduced maintenance and financial obligations, different from that of a single-family detached home. An example of a mixed-unit development that serves variable incomes and living needs is the Kingsley Park development in Essex Middle River, which completed construction in 2018. The overall intent of the development was to provide a mix of housing choices to serve the many needs of an existing community by offering senior housing in addition to single-family attached and detached homes of varying sizes and price points. Proximity to services, shops, public transportation, schools, and open spaces also contribute to the successful mix of housing types, which provides equal importance to each type, and affordable units are dispersed throughout the development, making them indistinguishable from market rate homes. When considering the MBIA request to allow a minimum width of the 16 or 18-foot wide unit, we have some questions that we'd like you all to think about, and we included these in our report that we sent to you ahead of this meeting. Do the costs of construction of townhomes justify a reduction of the by right width for the entire county? Would providing a mix of townhouses within the community help meet the goals of the county's enterprise strategic plan? Providing adequate and properly located parking as well as open space would be pivotal in the design of the townhome community. Reduced townhome width will increase the potential number of homes on a site, enabling development to reach the maximum density and potentially increase impervious surface areas, among other added issues. Providing more units on the land by right could impact overall quality of design with a loss of open and green space, increased stormwater runoff, and reduced space for landscaping. Amenities may require a greater emphasis for the residents in order to create the vibrant, sustainable, and equitable communities we so desire. The recommendation from the Department of Planning would be to retain the minimum townhouse width of 20 feet, and it does not support the townhouse width to be a minimum of 16 feet as a matter of right throughout the county. The department would recommend supporting a reduced width townhouse as a conditional use with the following conditions. Those would be development of a reduced width units may not be granted waivers or variances for building height and setbacks requirements, landscaping, local open space requirements. In addition, environmental areas should not be minimized or altered. In a major subdivision, we would recommend that the plan show a balanced mixture of equal distribution of townhouses with different widths across the site. Townhouses that are 16 or 18 feet wide may only be placed on interior units of a townhouse, for example, and along the interior network of the development. Any units identified as high visibility shall be 20 feet wide or above. Reduced width townhouse development may only be located within the growth tier 1 designated areas of the county. And finally, we would recommend the following table showing the recommended location for parking for each townhouse type. And that is the table that's here on the right. And if it were a 16-foot wide, for example, these would be our recommendations so as to minimize the impact of what the vehicular component of a townhouse does to the design of the development. We wouldn't recommend a front car garage, or we would accept a parking pad for one car, but primarily the recommendation would be to put the parking for the reduced townhome width in the rear of the unit. And that concludes the presentation.
Thank you, Ms. Nugent. Do any of the board members have any questions?
I do.
Madam
Go ahead.
Okay. Wait. Paul?
Okay. Is there any reason that the PUD process that does allow 16 and 18-foot townhouses, is there any reason that is not sufficient? Seems like people can get that if they want.
Correct. And as I showed in our made in one statement, we did an analysis of all the PUDs within the ERDL within the last 10 years. Was it 10? And only 3 of the 14 that we found took advantage of the reduced width.
So it doesn't seem to be widely in demand.
No.
Okay.
I guess my questions are a little different. My concern is more about housing affordability. And I heard your comments, but if you don't change the density of building on the reduced land that we have left, I'm a economist by nature, I'm a banker, so supply and demand is going to continue to drive the prices of housing up to a point that affordability is going to be unattainable. So, I guess my question is, if we're going to allow them to do 18-foot wides, you're saying that you wouldn't allow them to have, so if there's 100 houses and we take 2 feet off those houses, we should be able to build, I don't know, 16 more houses. Are you saying that you wouldn't allow them to build the additional 16 houses? Because that's where the savings is going to come. The cost is not in the actual physical structure, it's in the land cost that you have to pay for land because of supply and demand. So
Right. Well, no development's going to be able to build beyond what the allowable density is. Our apprehension is allowing a reduced width by right. We wouldn't want a single, comprehensive development to be all that same width. We would prefer to see a mix. We think that's the best recommendation.
Yeah, I guess I appreciate your comment, but frankly, it still does not solve the problem of housing affordability. So if you don't allow them to build more houses, then there's no economic benefit to having the 18/20. So, so I guess I think that's the underlying difference in what your presentation is. If I can get 10 more houses out of that development, that's where the major cost savings is. And that's where you have increased supply, and that would drive down net costs. So I guess it's
Mr. Warren, if I may, as Ms. Nugent pointed out, when they looked at the data points that MBIA provided and compared it to what the websites were for those particular projects or developments, there was no necessarily reduced cost. Now, if MBIA has additional data that they can present at the public hearing that shows, in fact, that the cost would be reduced and therefore more affordable to more people, then that may be more persuasive. But that was not the data that they shared with the department when we went into this analysis.
I guess again, I'm just being, supply and demand. If there's more supply and demand stays constant, the price will come down. So I don't, by saying a house is $450,000 because it's 16 foot wide now, we don't know that it wouldn't be $600,000 if it wasn't that way. So it's the counter argument to that, how do you prove that? Like, you have to just use economics and say that if there's, my big fear is I don't want to live in San Francisco. I don't want to live in Portland where people that make $100,000 a year have to live in a mobile home because they can't afford to live there. And we're going to head there if we don't increase the hurdle to build more houses. We continue down a path of reducing the places that you can build. You got to get higher density. It's got to happen. So I guess I'll end my end.
Thank you, Mr. Warren.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions?
I have one.
Mr. Halipka?
You were saying that this would mostly apply to places that are zoned DR 10.5 or DR 16, correct?
Townhouses are also permitted in the DR 55, but they do need to meet the compatibility requirements of the Baltimore County Code.
So I guess my question is, do we have a sense what percentage of, I guess it's two ways, what percentage of the developable land is currently zoned that high? And how much of that is not yet developed? I mean, so how much of that would have to be redeveloped if someone wanted to put in a 16-foot wide project? Do we have any ideas about that?
I know we did that analysis and I didn't provide it in the report, but I'm happy to provide it as follow-up.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Nugent. Board members, any other questions at this time?
At some point, Nance.
Yes.
Okay. I have to agree with Mr. Warren about his most important thing, and I think you've all heard me talk about affordability in the county. I greatly believe in it. I was very adamant about it in many districts as we did our zoning process last year. I would tell you, Ms. Nugent, I think you intellectually, your report probably, is as a planning department would come up with, and the issues and the comments that you have. I do believe practically you're missing a lot of information that's actually out there right now. Everything that a planning department might do anywhere in the country is normally a couple of years behind in the numbers. I think most of us have seen and read in the last year and a half of the pandemic that cost of construction have risen anywhere from 30% to 50% on all new construction. I've been involved in townhouse development, building, settlement, whatever, for the last 40 years. I've seen projects in Harford County that had 16-foot, out of 400 houses, 300 of them were 16-foot, and the developer and builder blew through those houses because the affordable house of the 16-foot, which is really a very nice house, you end up with two 16-foot master bedrooms instead of two 8x8 or 8x10 second and third bedrooms in that house. It was very well received. I've seen many others built in Anne Arundel County, Prince George's County as well. We haven't, like you say, you can show the numbers. We only have 3 projects that did them. I did the Towson Muse project, and I would tell you they're very well received. You said the price of those homes are in the $400,000 range. I've settled 3 in the last 3 months at over $550,000. The 16 footers will bring less than the 550s, but that means Towson, where when Bozzuto designed them and sold them and built them, they were for the teachers at Towson State University. They might have been, some of them, for students that their parents might have helped them, but it was, again, an affordable house. So was Towson Muse. If you look at Anne Arundel County, their townhouses are in excess of $500,000 now, unless it was a project in Severn that had many 16 footers. If you look at Howard County, again, townhouses in the 550 range going up to $700,000. We're not there yet in Baltimore County at those prices, but we're moving there. And that's my concern is, again, being a minority county, that over 50% of our population is minority, these numbers are going to get so out of line as many other parts of our state. We don't even want to talk about the cost of townhouses in Montgomery County or in Alexandria, Virginia, or other places around DC, because they're out of sight. But there is a reason to build 16 versus 20. There was a project in Owings Mills, Queen Anne, many, many years ago. I was a salesman during law school at that time, and they built different ones, and I was selling against them. So there are people that really do like it. Some of the pictures you've shown of Towson Muse are very well-built houses, well-designed, well-constructed. The MBIA's comments to you to allow possibly some higher height requirements, to me, makes sense, because then you can, no different than we've seen in the city. I'm not saying we need to approve this, but people that have built decks to have views over certain areas. We might not build along the Chesapeake Bay in the future, but if you built back from the bay and you had the ability to put a rooftop deck going, as they do in the Inner Harbor, you might have people that love to buy those homes 500 feet away from the Chesapeake Bay. I think that there's much that the MBIA projects. I think if you really do look at the question of affordability and what housing is going to cost for our children, I'd like to see my children be able to live closer to me and not be able to buy in York, PA, Hanover, or Gettysburg, where they can buy a single family home for $250,000, for $250,000. That's a problem, but I don't really want them being forced to move an hour or an hour and a half away. Again, I read your report very carefully. I understand it, I believe, but I do look at the practical side of it and see what people are paying for housing. And I understand that what they're going to do, and they are doing, is those that can't afford a $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 townhouse, where are they moving? And it's a good thing, are moving back to the city and buying $150,000 and $200,000 rehabbed houses. At that point, do they have the problems that we all talk about in the city, which are crime, education, those things? Absolutely. But those are the decisions that they're making because of the affordability part of it. That's my comments.
Madam Chair.
One last
Thank you,
thing.
Mr. Furlow.
One last thing. We do have a consent decree that tells us that we have to have affordable housing here in the county, and we need to be able to provide and comply with that for the Department of Housing. Very important.
Okay, Mrs. Nugent, 1 second, folks. Ms. Nugent, is there anything you'd like to add right now?
Yeah, I appreciate your comments, Mr. Perlow, and I certainly understand them. And I personally, from a personal standpoint, appreciate having a house be affordable because I'm a single working mother. And but our department's recommendation on doing this study was to not say they shouldn't be allowed. And I think MBIA's request of affordability is different from the consent decree. They're trying to make it affordable from a market rate demographic. And so our desire in creating, a successful development and a countywide goal of vibrant communities and meeting the strategic plan goals going into the future is to be able to take a look at the request and not dismiss it, but encourage you all to consider all the factors, and that's, possibly not allowing a reduced width holistically by right throughout the entire county, but instead considering a healthy mix of townhome widths within a single development.
We have such a limited amount of land left in our county without
Understood.
expanding the
Understood.
area.
I don't disagree.
Okay, compared to these other counties that are around us, and they're building 16 footers in these counties. And I think to use up the land properly, possibly in tier one, I have no problem that you might want to limit it there. But I think that it's really a good idea. I don't want to say a decent idea, but it's a good idea to be able to provide additional new housing instead of looking at some of the projects that are now 40 and 50 years old townhouse projects in the county that probably need some kind of redevelopment.
Okay, excuse me, folks, but there's other board members. Let's give them an opportunity to speak right now. Thank you. Anyone else have anything they'd like to share?
Yes, Nancy.
Yes?
I'd like to respond to Warren and Howard's remarks. I think that the last 30 years, people have been, in a free society, have been responding to increased cost by moving to areas where they can afford it. That's why they're moving to Adams County, York County, and other areas. Anybody who drives on 83 any evening can see what the results of that are. When you just add more housing units or more residential units, you're adding cost to the existing people who are living in the county through infrastructure, through schools, through additional cost. So it's not a one size fits all type of thing, but people that are have been and are moving to areas where they can afford.
So they drive across our roads, they take our incomes from our area and take and go and spend them in their communities that we don't get any benefit from. So that's a not the right attitude to have around that we want to have a vibrant business community and support the businesses in our community. We want people to live here and thrive here. The last question I have, I gotta jump in, Nancy, is I don't see what structurally, why is it a bad thing 16 versus 20? Have you found that people don't want that, or how does that hurt the community?
Ms. Nugent?
What was the question? I wasn't clear.
How does a 16 versus 20 hurt a community? I don't see the negative. Explain the negative to me.
Well, I'm going to take your question as asking me if you were to do a 120 unit, all 16 foot wide housing development, that would be visually very intensely developed. And
20, you would see that difference?
well, I guess we could do a mock-up.
I don't see
Okay,
it.
folks.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions this evening?
I'm sorry, Nance, I'm going to make one more comment. I would tell you that all the developments that have 16 footers, generally the end units are all built as 20 footers. They're the end units. The prices are generally higher. There sometimes is mix in the units, as Towson Muse were, that there were 16, 20, then a 16, then a 20. So they were mixed up. I don't think you're going to see any developer that's going to propose an entire, and based on your comments, I think that's a very good mediation idea to have both if you're going to allow 16 footers, that you also are going to have 20s. It's no different than when you build a 20-foot development and you take the ends and you make them 24 and they make that an upscale unit. So, that's not what's going to happen. No builder is going to build 200 16 footers. That's not what he wants either. He wants to have the range of prices so that he does make some additional revenue from his wider units, and then is also able, though, to accommodate somebody who doesn't have the income to buy that 16 footer.
Thank you, Mr. Perlow. Now, does anyone else have any comments or questions that they'd like to ask Ms. Nugent?
Yes, please. Jen, so I have one comment, which is it could be the difference between a townhouse and the look of a row house. And the other question is, if there were 16 feet wide, would they still adhere to the 6 in a row standard currently in place, or would that number in a row expand?
I'm a little rusty on my math. I know we did that analysis because it's 6 in a row or 120 feet long, whichever is less. And Steve, do you remember what we wound up with a decimal?
Yeah, I thought it was actually whichever was more, so that if it were 6 by 16 would be 96, so you could get a 7th unit in to that row, as opposed to with 20 feet, you're at 6 units per group. So Ms. Wolfson, yes, you would end up with at least, potentially with at least one more if all of them were 16 feet wide.
And that's without any variances granted, correct?
Correct.
Thank you.
Okay, board members, if there aren't any other questions, we are going to call a public, set a motion for a public hearing. So there will be further discussion on this matter. So I'd like to entertain a motion to set a public hearing.
I'll make
Okay.
that.
Be it moved that the Baltimore County Planning Board set a public hearing regarding minimum width requirements for Thursday, September 23rd, 2021 at 5 p.m.
Thank you. May I have a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All right, motion carries. Now, next on the agenda, we have a presentation from the Department of Planning, also led by Ms. Nugent, Division Chief, Development Review on the Davis Farms PAI-0606 Master Plan Conflict. Following Ms. Nugent's presentation, Council will represent the developer and protestants and People's Council and members of the public will have an opportunity to speak. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Nugent.
I'm pitching a double header today.
I know you are.
Okay. Thank you. I'm here to talk about what was identified in the ALJ's opinion and order on the Davis Farm Development Plan after the hearing had concluded as a master plan conflict. Procedurally, a development plan is supposed to be referred to the planning board by the administrative law judge when it is deemed at the development plan hearing that the plan conflicts with the master plan. In this instance, the conflict was identified by the ALJ in his order after the hearing had concluded that the development plan was in conflict with the Master Plan 2020 Land Use Transect designation and therefore denied approval of the development plan. The matter was then presented before the Board of Appeals on a motion to intervene, wherein which the Board of Appeals remanded the case back to the ALJ for referral to the planning board as is required by the Baltimore County Code, section 324231A1, which is before you presently. The Davis Farm proposal came into review by county agencies in January of 2019. The community input meeting was held on February 27th, 2019, and a development plan was submitted to the county agencies in January 2020, which is within the code requirement of filing the development plan within 1 year of the date of the community input meeting, as cited in Baltimore County Code section 324221. Subsequent to the development plan review, The administrative law judge development plan hearing was held on January 20th, 2021, in which agencies recommended approval of the development. At no time in the multi-agency review, nor at the hearing, was a master plan conflict identified as is required per the Baltimore County Code. I'm sorry, just previously I wanted to show you this map that we created on this slide. Shows the different zoning classes. The dark black outline is the site boundary of the development plan. And then we have overlaid the current zoning classifications with the proposed development for Davis Farm. The development site is 21.17 acres. And the zoning breakdown is 12.17 acres is DR1, 2.95 acres is DR2, 0.99 acres of DR35, 4.94 acres of RC5, and a sliver of RC8 at 0.12 acres. All the proposed development for the site, it was located within the DR1, 2, and 3.5 zone portions of the property, and it also proposed to only use the density from the DR zones for the development. The portion at the rear of the site, zone the RC5, was wooded and was proposed to remain wooded. In developing the Master Plan 2020, the proposed land use map was reformatted from specific land uses to a transect model. The purpose of this reframing of the proposed land use map was to strengthen the concept which guides land use decisions in a general manner rather than for specific properties. In a fashion similar to the Master Plan 2010, text from the Master Plan 2020 framed how the proposed land use map should be utilized. Quoting specifically from page 27, Master Plan 2020, the proposed land use transect map is conceptual in general as intended to reflect land use patterns and support the land use objectives of Master Plan 2020, rather than identify land use of individual properties or parcels. The use of T-zones is designed to support compact mixed-use communities while maintaining the stability of the existing community conservation areas. The proposed land use map will provide general direction from county land use decision to form county land use decisions and may be amended as needed. The slide that we have here shows the Master Plan 2020 transect designations for the site as being the pale yellow T3 suburban and the light green as the T2R rural residential. The T2R rural residential zone is important to note that is a rural residential that it allows residential development. It consists of large lot, single-family detached housing. The T3 suburban transect character describes lawns and landscape yards surrounding detached single-family homes with variable front and side yard setbacks. As shown on these maps on this slide, the property has been subject to zoning changes since 2008. The 2008 request, which was CZMP issue number 1-016, was to rezone the property from solely DR zoning to all RC5 or RC8 zoning. The Department of Planning did not support the request, and the Planning Board adopted the department's recommendation. The final decision by the County Council was to keep the DR zoning for most of the property and rezone the 4.94 acres of the site to RC5. Subsequent CZMPs have retained that RC5 classification, After reviewing the Master Plan 2020 proposed land use map, the urban-rural demarcation line, and the zoning map at the time of the Master Plan 2020 adoption, the transect designation for the development proposal was mapped to run coincident with the zoning class. So again, I'm showing you the 2004 map, which the whole site was DR zoning. In 2008, the rezoning at the back of the site was rezoned to RC5. The next 3 quadrennial zoning cycles left the zoning on the development site intact, which is shown here in 2012, 2016, and the current zoning is in 2020. In 2012, there were some adjacent pieces that rezoning was requested and granted to be RC8. And then, but as you can see, the RC5 on the back portion of the site continued to remain RC5. There was a change in 2016 of a portion of these RC8 pieces to be upgraded to RC8 and C. After doing an analysis of the master plan, the Department of Planning supported the proposed development plan without raising an issue of conformity with Master Plan 2020. The Transact designation of T3 for this property is appropriate, as the general character description from Master Plan 2020 states that areas should be comprised of, quote, lawns and landscaped yards surrounding detached single-family houses with variable front and side yard setbacks. As you can see from the multiple layers of master plan designations, the T3 transect and the DR zoning, the DR 1, 2, and 3.5 on this site support one another in that concept. The T2R transect designation is located on a minor portion of the development site that is fully wooded and coincides with RC5 zoning adopted in a 2008 CZMP zoning cycle. The T2R transect on this site does not in itself create a master plan conflict, as no development is proposed on that portion of the site and it uses no density from that portion of the site. At the time the Master Plan 2020 was adopted, a majority of the zoning for the proposed development proposal was DR. Today, it remains as DR. The combination of the DR classifications shows the number of density units proposed. The entire development proposal site falls completely within the urban portion of the URDL. The land management area map from Master Plan 2020 designates the site as community conservation area, which describes this land use as low to moderate density residential neighborhoods served by public water and sewer services. This designation follows the residential zoning on the site, inclusive of the RC5 zoning. In conclusion, the Department of Planning recommends to the Baltimore County Planning Board that the Davis Farm development proposal does not present a master plan conflict, and that the Planning Board approve the single-family detached development plan with the Master Plan 2020 T2R transect designation on the proposed land use map. And that wraps up my presentation. I think you're muted, Nancy.
Thank you, Ms. Nugent. I know you've had to share a lot this evening. We really do appreciate it, but we have a lot of people that have come out tonight to speak on this matter. Does any of the board members have any questions from Ms. Nugent at this time?
I guess my only question is you're the person that's saying that it matches up with our master plan. So why is this in front of us? Like, if it matches the master plan, why are we doing this?
So what occurred after the development hearing before the ALJ had concluded and the ALJ had to write his order, he denied the development plan in his order, citing a master plan conflict. So that is not how it's written in the code that that's supposed to process. A master plan conflict is supposed to be raised throughout the development plan process before the development plan process concludes. And so therefore a motion was filed by the development applicant on that decision. It went to the Board of Appeals. The Board of Appeals remanded it back to the administrative law judge to follow the code requirement of citing a master plan conflict to go to the planning board. And so that is why it is before you today in accordance with the county code.
I guess maybe ask the question better. You're saying that this is in alignment with the master plan.
That is the Department of Planning's position, yes.
I guess that's my point. Like, why? Okay, never mind.
Thank you, Mr. Warren.
If I may, Madam Chair, as Ms. Nugent just said, Mr. Warren, under the county code, the administrative law judge referred this to the planning board to determine whether or not there's a master plan conflict. So the position of the department doesn't influence whether it is referred to the planning board. That was administrative law judge's obligation under the code. So
okay,
it's our position. You'll hear obviously from council and on the issue too. And if I may, Madam Chair, just for a moment, I also want to thank the council that are participating tonight, because each of them have agreed to agreed sort of time limit so that each gets a fair opportunity to make their presentation, but also in recognition of the time constraints for the planning board. And as the chair will say, each of you then will have a chance to question not only them, but the members of the public who are here to speak. But we're following the code, Mr. Warren, to try and make sure we live up to our obligation.
I just thought it was funny. We wrote the code, and if we say it is, it
Yeah.
is.
Well, thank you. All right. Thank you, Mr. Warren. All right. Right now, we're going to hear from the council. Council, please limit your time to at least 20 minutes or less. We're going to hear from Mr. Howard Alterman, counsel for the developer. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Alterman.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the board. Howard L. Alderman Jr. on behalf of the applicants, Ms. Hammond and Ms. Wessel. Ms. Nugent is correct. This plan went through the entire development process without ever even considering a master plan conflict. We were frankly shocked when we got the administrative law judge's opinion, where he raises a master plan conflict and bases his decision, at least in part, on that. I noted an appeal to the Board of Appeals challenging that. And it's the Board of Appeals that said, no, this is not the right way to do it. If the ALJ thinks there's a master plan conflict, he's got to stop the hearing before him and refer it to you, the planning board. That never happened. Master plan conflict was never discussed, not at the concept plan stage, not at the development plan stage, not at the hearing officer's hearing. This development, as you heard Ms. Nugent say, is very low density. The development's all in a DR1, DR2, and DR3.5. 19 houses less than what is permitted by the zoning. Now I'm going to touch on just one portion of the opinion regarding master plan, and I'll turn it over to Mr. Pernuzzi, who will address the other portions. On page 11 of the opinion, Judge Mayhew says the 2020 master plan states that existing community members are supposed to have an integral role in the creation of sustainable developments through collaborative efforts. On page 18 of the opinion, the judge said the master plan mandates that the community members are to have an integral role in the creation of sustainable developments through collaborative efforts. Somehow, after the hearing, he determined that didn't apply. However, this development plan proceeded through the entire development process. Not like the old CRG, which some of you may remember, where the community didn't get to see the plan until the day of the hearing. There was a concept plan submitted, then there was a community input meeting, at which time all adjoining owners received copies of the concept plan, as well as copy of agency comments. Their input was taken at the community input meeting. Following that, within the year, a development plan was submitted. Development comments were generated. Everyone who got the original concept plan and everyone who attended the community input meeting got a copy of the development plan, got a copy of the notice of hearing, and the date and time the property was posted. A public hearing was then held before the ALJ, at which time certainly we as the applicant, as well as any member of the community, had the opportunity to testify on a plan of development. At no time during that hearing was there an alleged master plan conflict. if Judge Mayhew had testimony or evidence of a master plan conflict, the law required him to continue the hearing and refer the development plan to this board. That action wasn't taken, as there is no conflict. Single-family detached homes surrounded by yard space of varying widths, it fits the T3 transect, even though the transect is not supposed to be applied to any individual particular property by the strict terms of the master plan. I'm now going to turn it over to Mr. Michael Piernuzzi regarding the development plan's further compliance with the master plan. Thank you. Michael? Madam Chair, is
You
Yes,
need to
Mr.
share your
Alderman.
screen. What do you need, Howard?
I don't see Mr. Michael Paranunzi on here as a panelist.
Okay.
I don't see him on the screen.
I have a copy of his permit, or his report, so I'll just run through it very quickly.
Okay, thank you.
Proposed zoning permits, 21 lots and 19 are proposed. I'm going to summarize given the lateness of the hour. All development is within the DR zone. Throughout the development process, no county agency referenced any conflict with the master plan. When reviewing the 2020 master plan to the development plan, no conflicts are apparent. The master plan proposes land management areas that organize the county into general policy areas, such as urban and rural areas, and recommends the use of transect-based planning. The master plan states that the land use map showing transects, is conceptual and general, as intended to reflect land use patterns rather than identify land use of individual properties or parcel. As you heard Ms. Nugent say, there are both T2R, TR3, or T3. All of development is in the T3. In the T3, it shows low density residential areas adjacent to higher zones that contain mixed use. That's the suburban zone. Home occupations and outbuildings may be allowed. Landscaping is naturalistic and setbacks are generally deep. Per the development plan, the proposed layout meets the DR zoning and the T3 transect. The 19 lots are designed meeting all zoning setbacks. No variances were requested. The site meets all stormwater management and environmental requirements comfortably on site. The layout provides open space and connection to the adjoining park properties. You'll note to the south and to the west, it's all public park property. Moreover, the proposed public road, this is on Maple Avenue, which runs north and south from its intersection with Frederick Road. All students living on Maple Avenue have to walk up to Frederick Road to catch the bus because the bus has no place to turn around. Davis Farms Road, which is part of this development, is a loop road. It will provide not only delivery vehicles, but also the school bus the opportunity to come down Maple Avenue, picking students up as it goes, drive through the proposed development, and then make a left turn and go back out to Frederick Road, picking up students on its way back. The plan has been processed through the review and approval process, and Mr. Piernuzzi, where he testifying tonight, said he would agree with the recommendations of the Department of Planning that the Davis Farm Development Plan proposal does not in any way present a master plan conflict. So, not to put words in his mouth, but I'll end it there. And I thank you, members of the board, for the opportunity to present this, and I'll answer any questions that any of you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Alderman. Any questions from the board? Next, we'll hear from Mr. Michael McCann, counsel for the protestants. Please join me in welcoming Mr. McCann.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Ms. Chairman. Would I have the ability to share? I may have a couple of exhibits that I may show the board. Could you transfer that to me? Great. Thank you very much. As the chairwoman just indicated, I represent the folks on Maple Avenue, and I want to talk a little bit about the neighborhood because we haven't heard that much about it, because when we get to the master plan conflict, discussion, which I will get to, it is clear from the master plan that you do have to take into consideration not just what the proposed development is, but also its impacts on what's there. And let me tell you a little bit about what's there. So this neighborhood is not a planned subdivision. It's a neighborhood that has grown organically over the years. There are a lot of old homes with a lot of people that have lived there for a very long time. The 40 homes that line Maple Avenue form a very small, if you ever drive down that road, ever get a chance to, it'd be unusual if you did, but they form a small, very intact, bucolic neighborhood with mature trees and mature houses. Maple Avenue itself dead ends. It's only 0.4 miles long, and it dead ends next at Patapsco State Park. And I'll talk a little bit about the natural resources associated with this site and how they're an extension of the park. But the road itself is very narrow. Near the site, it's only 15.5 feet wide. There's no sidewalks. Many of the homes don't have driveways, so you often see cars parked in the road or cars turning around, sometimes on private property, to even get out of the neighborhood. In fact, as Mr. Alderman referred to, because the road is so narrow, school buses don't go down the road. So the 30 or so kids that attend school have to walk down Maple Avenue to its intersection with Frederick Road to get to the school bus. There is a lot of foot and bike traffic on this road, both from the folks that live there who walk, jog, walk the dogs there, from the kids who live there who play with their friends in the road, but also non-residents, because it is an access to Patapsco State Park. You'll see mountain bikers riding down the road to access the park. So there's a lot going on this very small road, 15.5 feet wide. Let me just show you real quick. You'll hear about it from my clients who will speak after me. I wanted to share a photograph that I think is bear with me 1 second. Hopefully you can see this. These are my clients standing in the road. You'll see the narrow width of it. Barely enough for 2 cars to go by, certainly not enough for 2 cars and construction vehicles and things of that sort to pass by. So you should also know, I mentioned that I represent the folks on this road. During the course of the hearing, we introduced a petition that was signed by 150 people opposing this development for lots of reasons, which we'll get to. With 1 or 2 exceptions, every single house, all 40 houses in this neighborhood expressed their opposition to the development and concern about its impacts. I'm going to speak a little bit longer about the master plan conflicts, and then let my folks speak with the remainder of my time. They'll speak to you about, as you'll see, about stormwater management issues that they've been having since they've been living there, about failing septic systems, about traffic concerns, about impacts on environmental resources. But let me turn, if I could, now to the specific master plan conflicts that we believe the ALJ was correct about, even though the process may not have been appropriate, but he was spot on in our opinion about the conflicts. So let me just, I have a handout that I'll submit to the board after the hearing. And I'm not going to read to the board. I'm just going to highlight a couple of things. And the first point I wanted to make was, as I said before, one of the things that the master plan does, and maybe it's not recognized all the time, is it speaks quite a bit about preservation of existing communities and protecting against impacts to those communities, as opposed to simply whether or not a proposed development should or should not be in a specific location. So in this handout that I'll give to the board, it speaks about those types of things. In fact, it says many existing stable residential neighborhoods should not be disturbed for additional development, things of that sort. There are also provisions dealing with infrastructure in the master plan, which I won't get into any detail, but we have serious problems with some of the infrastructure associated with this neighborhood. You'll see photographs from my clients with the significant ponding on this road on a regular basis during rainstorms. You also hear stories about septic systems, I'm sorry, the sewer system failing. And then, of course, protection of natural resources. I wanted to look back at the site plan. I know Mr. Alderman referred to it quickly. I wanted to show the board just how significant the resources are on this property. You'll see I've outlined in black the entire site, which is about 21 acres. Everything beyond the green, you'll see that's all forest buffer, forest conservation areas. The yellow depicts a floodplain. The blue depicts stream systems that go through the property, and the pink areas are areas of wetlands. And so the site, the 21 houses, I'm sorry, the 19 houses are within this area right here, which is roughly, don't hold me to this exact number, but is roughly, you know, just a little more than half of the site, so approximately 10 acres or so. So the 19 houses, they're in a half circle here, are all sitting on roughly half of the site. So when we look at density, and I'll get the density in a second, I think it's important to consider that we're not fitting 19 houses on 21 acres. We're fitting 19 houses on half of that. Let me get back to, if I could, the handout. The two main things, parts of the master plan that I wanted to focus in on, and frankly, neither planning office nor Mr. Alderman really discussed them at all. You will see in the master plan for a T3 transect, but this is in the T3 transect, that it requires low density residential areas and setbacks that are relatively deep. With respect to density, I just mentioned to you that, and this I'll give this handout to you, that although 24 units are allowed on this 21 acres and 19 are proposed, 5 less than are allowed, we're talking about a much smaller area in terms of the developable area of the property. And in terms of density as well, we have 40 homes there now. Adding 19 will increase the density by 40%. There was an exhibit introduced below that I think sort of tells that story very, very vividly. If you take a look at, this is Maple Avenue. The green is obviously the existing houses. The red are the proposed 19 houses. And that's just, in my mind, that's a good visual of what this increase in density will look like. Real quick, getting back to some other things about density. I looked at the size of these lots. There's 19 of them. The lots range from 0.27 acres to 0.63 acres. So the average is about 0.41 acres. Most of them, 14 of the 19, are in this middle range between 0.3 and 0.5. That is not low density in our opinion. The existing neighborhood, just to compare, there are a couple, there's 3.2 lots, but the vast majority of the lots are well above that, and the largest one, aside from the subject property, is 6 acres. The average lot size of the existing community is 0.97 acres, whereas the proposed development is going to be less than that, so double the density. 39 of the 40 lots are larger than the smallest proposed lot. 19 of the lots we're talking about the existing lots, are larger than the largest proposed lot, 0.63 acres. So those are just some facts about density that I think tell the story that this is not low density, certainly in comparison to what's around it. Next, real quick about setbacks. The master plan setbacks are relatively deep. The setbacks provided for these 19 lots are the minimum required in the zoning regulations, 25 feet. That is not a deep lot. That's what the code requires, the regulations require rather. So I compared that to the existing neighborhood. 37 of the 40 homes have a setback of from 30 to 135 feet. So again, taking into consideration what's there and the fact that the proposed lots are meeting only the minimum setback as opposed to anything deeper, we believe both of those, just on their face, are master plan conflicts. Real quick, the T2R transect, a portion of the property, as Jennifer mentioned, is in the T2R. We can't ignore it. I know Mr. Alderman would want us to ignore it, but if you take a look at these 4 provisions in the master plan for the T2R, I'm not even going to discuss them because you'll see that none of these portions of the master plan are complied with. These are certainly not large lots. The setbacks aren't greater than 50 feet. They're not deep, and the density does not vary between 2 and 5 acres. The highest density, as I indicated, is 0.63 acres, the lot size that is. And so those are the master plan conflicts. The last thing I wanted to mention is this concept, and if you read Mr. Nugent's report, I think what the planning office did in this instance was, and it says it explicitly in the recommendation, that the transect designation is not to be used for development of individual lots, but rather is a bigger picture for planning purposes. And if you look closely at the language in the master plan, and particularly since the provisions of the master plan are mandatory, contrary to what a lot of people think, you have to take some consideration of the transects. I don't think even Mr. Alderman would tell you that you ignore them. And my point is simply, if you take them into consideration, that is what they say, whether you're talking on a micro or macro level, I think it's pretty clear that these conflicts that I identified exist. And I haven't seen anything from the planning office or from Mr. Alderman that changes those conflicts. And with that, I will let my folks speak. I know we're going to limit our comments. There's quite a few people in the neighborhood, obviously, but I'm going to ask just a few of those folks. I think 2 or 3 are prepared to speak to you. So I'll turn it over to them if I could, and I'll stop sharing at this point. Thank you, members of the board. I'm happy to answer any questions about the project itself or about the master plan. And sorry for talking so fast.
Does anyone have any questions for Mr. McCain? No?
I have.
Nancy?
Are we within the Erdl in the metropolitan district, or we're not?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, both. We're in both areas.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Nancy?
Yes.
So I guess my question is, given these concerns, why weren't they raised throughout the development process? Why did it take till the very end?
Everything I've mentioned, aside from the specific master plan conflicts, but the concerns of my clients were absolutely mentioned. If you're asking about the master plan conflict itself, that's a good question. I do this stuff day in and day out. I'm not before the board very often, but I do this stuff more than anybody else does in terms of opposition work. And I don't know why it's not referred more often to the planning board. Master plan conflicts should be. And they arise more often than we think, but I don't really have a reason for that, sir. And it wasn't raised. My clients weren't, I should mention, my clients were not represented by me before the ALJ. They handled it themselves. Once the ALJ's decision was issued, I picked up the case. So no reason. There's no excuse or reason why it was not raised.
Thank you, Mr. Halupka. Any other questions from the board? If not, we're going to go to our other speaker, Mr. Pete Zimmerman, the Office of the People's Counsel. Welcome, Mr. Zimmerman.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Can everybody see me, or?
Yes, we can see you.
Okay, and I know Mr. McCann has some citizens as well, but all right, it's great to be here, even with Howard Alderman, who I have a lot of respect for, Michael McCann, and of course you, Madam Chair, and Steve Lafferty. I've known all of you. It's great to be here, and many members of the planning board I think I've interacted with in the past, but some not so much. So I will give a little perspective answering Mr. Warren's question, or how is it we're here. But first I wanted to give a little background. Under the county charter, we have both a master plan and comprehensive zoning maps, and they are quite different. As you know, the master plan gets prepared and adopted every 10 years. The comprehensive zoning is in zoning regulations. Every 4 years, the maps are reviewed. Our office does not represent the protestants, right? Our office was created in 1974 as a public interest office to defend the comprehensive zoning maps. And there was a lot of history to the 1970s that some of you may recall. In 1978, the charter section 524.1 was amended specifically to assign us to defend the master plan in the public interest. So we look at these situations objectively to defend the law, and that's our function. And the county council, under the legislation that was mentioned by Ms. Nugent in the code, has decided that not only there's a referral to the planning board when there's a master plan conflict identified, but that the development plans have to comply with the master plan. Okay, it's mandatory. And this is critical to understand, because the master plan is advisory on comprehensive zoning. It's not advisory here. I sent a letter last week, August 25th, a 7-page letter to Chair Hafford. I hope she's had a chance to share it with you, and that I know you're all hardworking board members with lots of things to do, but I hope you would read my letter. And I attached the administrative law judge opinion. I attached the master plan transects and other information, including the planning office's original comment on this development plan. And last week, or a few days ago, I also sent to Steve Lafferty and Chair Hafford the landmark Court of Appeals case on Baltimore County master plan and development plan, which I think is critical. And this is a case that came out of Kingsville and was decided after many years of litigation in 2012, called HNS Development versus People's Council. And for years, we were dealing with the arguments of developers and sometimes the planning office that the master plan is not really intended to deal with specific sites. It's kind of general, it's kind of advisory. It doesn't really have an impact on a particular development plan, okay? And you can read the case beginning, the most important parts of the case begin at page 450. And we won the case, and the Court of Appeals said, with reference to a very specific property in Kingsville, where there was master plan issues regarding protecting a historic mansion, the court said it is mandatory as to the specific site, okay? And Judge Harrell, and I'm just going to read a couple of quotes from the opinion, and we had won the case also at the Court of Special Appeals. He said, we agree with the Court of Special Appeals reasoning when the development regulations incorporate master plan compliance, the master plan itself becomes a regulatory device rather than a mere guide and recommendation. He went on, quoted another case, when subdivision regulations require a proposed subdivision comply with the master plan, an application for approval of a plan that fails to so comply must be rejected, okay? The master plan in this particular context is strong and it's mandatory, okay? And I would say it's on a par with the 10 Commandments. There has to be compliance. And the transects, there's nothing in the master plan that says the transects are some kind of vague thing that we really don't have to worry about in specific cases, okay? There's a very nice discussion of transects, which I quoted in my letter, and they're quite specific. They're very defined categories with the criteria, and Mr. McCann has given you the criteria on this transects here. So this is not like a softball situation where we don't have to worry about the transects. Now, how did we get here? And I'm going to comment on the Department of Planning reports and Judge Mayhew's opinion and how we got here, and then comment on their current report. And Mr. Warren and maybe others are still a little interested, how did we get here and why not sooner? What happened in the development plan process, as we've now reviewed it, in the usual so-called concept plan conference comment that the planning office issues, department issues in every development plan case, the planning office did describe the T3 transect, the T2R transect, the community conservation area. It was right in the record. They did not make a determination one way or the other as to whether there was a master plan conflict. Okay, but the master plan core was right in there in the record. Okay, prior to the hearing, the department did not further address the master plan. When they got to the hearing, on page 3 of the opinion, you can read this. 2 members of the Department of Planning testified on various aspects, including their final report. They did not mention the master plan. But the master plan was right. The comments were right there initially as to what the transects were. Master plan conflict is always an issue. Administrative law judge is entitled on the record to look at everything. Now, it didn't get immediately back to the planning board, I would suggest, for this reason. There were a number of other issues which we're not discussing today, upon which the administrative law judge found that he had to deny the development plan. So given all these other problems, he understandably probably felt it was not necessary at that point, in the interest of efficiency, to send it immediately back on this issue, since there were so many other issues. The Board of Appeals on appeal took a different point of view and said, let's let the planning board look at this issue as well. So when this case eventually gets back to the Board of Appeals and wherever, this is just one of the issues in the case. So there are different points of view as to the timing, as to whether the judge should have referred it immediately. He felt there were other issues in the case and it wasn't necessary at that time. All right. So Judge Mayhew's comments or decision on the master plan are on page 18 of his opinion. Okay. And he basically went through some of the things that Mr. McCann pointed out. And the core of his opinion on page 18, they're just 2 paragraphs. Here's what he said. And the whole opinion I sent to you attached to my letter. Quote, in my view, the development plan in this case does not comply with the master plan vision for these transects. As the lot area table on the plan shows, the 19 proposed lots range from 0.27 to 0.63 acres, with the majority of the lots falling in the 0.30 to 0.45 range. And the typical lot layout on the plan for the lots in the DR1 and DR2 zones show front setbacks as little as 25 feet, side building to building distances of as little as 30 feet. And I'll interject, it's side building to building 30 feet. That means side setback 15 feet, and a few of them actually I think are 10 feet. Anyway, he says, quote, this is how 19 4 to 5 bedroom homes are squeezed onto the buildable portion of this tract, quote. Okay. The fact that the planning office department previously did not take a position one way or the other as to whether there was a conflict does not mean that the judge has to ignore the issue. Okay. In fact, the judge should be looking at this issue in every case, and the conflict issue should be prominent one way or the other in every case. Either there's a conflict or there's not a conflict. Okay. When the case came to my attention, it didn't take me long to 100% agree with Judge Mayhew. And if you look at the description of transects on pages 27 to 29 of the master plan, it's quite in depth, and it's an indication that they're quite specific and the criteria are quite specific. And in context, I would suggest to you that these relatively modest lots in the context of this neighborhood, it's not low density. The setbacks are certainly not deep. I mean, there's no way in the world that anyone could say that these are deep setbacks. And I want to say, Administrative Law Judge Mayhew, I think he's one of the best judges we've ever had. Okay, he is really good. And I think he has to be respected. Now, let me say something about why I happen to disagree as respectfully as I can with the planning department's position here. And I think the core of it is on page 3 of their report. And the first thing they say is that the department's, and I'm paraphrasing, the department supported the proposed development plan without raising an issue of conformity with the Master Plan 2020. Well, that's a nice way of saying it, but what happened was they described the Master Plan transects in the community conservation area. And by the way, I discussed the community conservation area conflict in my letter because there's supposed to be preservation of stability. But what they don't say in their current report is they simply did not address whether or not there was a conflict. They didn't take a position in writing. Whether that means that it implies that they're happy with it, may be, but they didn't articulate one way or the other whether there was or was not a conflict. Okay, in their next paragraph, or a few sentences later, and this is the key, I think, and maybe Ms. Nugent repeated this a few minutes ago. Quote, after reviewing the Master Plan 2020 proposed land use map, the urban-rural demarcation line and zoning map at the time of Master Plan 2020 adoption, the transect designation, and this is key, I'm quoting, the transect designation for the development proposal site was mapped to run coincident, that's a key word, coincident with the zoning classification. And goes on a sentence or two later, the T3 transect and the DR zoning support one another in that concept, okay? And here's what I would say, and this is a legal point, okay? This is not whether you like the development, you don't like the development, okay? What the planning office really is saying here is that the transects don't add anything to the zone, that as long as you comply with the zoning specifics, you don't have to worry about the transects or the master plan, okay? Basically, the master plan goes out the window. I'm being a little blunt here in their approach. But I would suggest to you strongly that the transects are meaningful. They are not nugatory. They are different from the zoning requirements. The criteria are different. They're mapped differently. They're described differently. It wasn't a waste of time, okay, when the people who worked on the master plan 2020, which I assume is partly the planning office back in 2010, when they went into this depth with these transects, okay, they have consequences. But I would suggest to you that in this case, the position of the department is that the transects have no consequences as to a specific property. Okay, so this is a fundamental disagreement, and I respect that people have different opinions. I often say Supreme Court justices don't always agree, but I think that this issue effectively was resolved by the Court of Appeals in the H&S development case when they agreed with us that the master plan criteria do apply to specific properties. And if the Department of Planning's thought process is correct, that the transects don't add anything, then I have a hard time imagining that they will ever say that there's a master plan conflict in any situation, because I think their perspective is that the master plan is general and advisory and doesn't have to be complied with down the line on specific properties. But I think that was resolved by the Court of Appeals. And it's an issue we've been struggling with for years. And I think we're right about that. And I'll kind of repeat myself that I respect all the work the planning department does, and I think I've said a number of times to the director that Supreme Court justices may respectfully disagree on different issues. So we have this disagreement on this particular case, and at the same time, I have tremendous respect for the department, especially Director Lafferty, who I've known for a long time, and I think is going to do a great job, and probably already doing a great job. But I happen to disagree with their report in this particular situation. And I think this is an important case because this is a key issue as to, which way.
2 minutes, Mr. Zimmerman.
I'm just about done.
Thank you.
This is a key case to kind of revisit. Is the master plan going to be implemented as a strong document, or is it going to be just sort of, in effect, put aside as something advisory that doesn't have to be complied with? And I have to say that the planning office report does not specifically respond to what Judge Mayhew said in his opinion. I haven't seen anything in writing to specifically contradict what he said. And I elaborated, he had many other issues to deal with. We have just the master plan issue here. I elaborated on the low density and the setbacks in my letter to you, which I sent last week. And I would hope that you all have the time to take a look at the writings that are submitted by any of the parties. And
Thank you, Mr.
again,
Zimmerman.
thank you.
We appreciate it.
That's it.
All right,
Thank
any
you.
of my board members have any questions? I know it's been a very long evening for you. We appreciate you all staying here. But we have a lot of people that want to make comments on this matter. So does anyone have any questions for Mr. Zimmerman? Okay, if not, at this time, I will call on all of you that have completed the online registration posted on the board's website to speak on this topic. In the order you registered, for those of you that have provided written testimony during the hearing, if any of you'd like to, you can do so by typing into the comment line or the chat box, and they will be read to the board members. Please refer to the online instructions for entering comments and procedures for speaking during the meeting. Speakers, remember, your comments are limited to 2 minutes or less. First, and thank you so much for your patience, Christy Katz.
Hi, thank you. My name is Christy Katz. I live at 7 Maple Avenue. Thank you for the time to speak today. Certainly the master plan was created to help guide smart land use decisions in our area. That being said, this development is literally adjacent to a targeted environmental area, which is identified as a conservation priority by the Maryland Department of Natural Resources, on a street prone to severe flooding and stormwater damage in a time where extreme rainfall events are not rare anymore. We really doubt that the 100-year floodplain and other antiquated environmental impact measures will help us when the stream has already been overwhelmed and washed out by flash flooding. It doesn't take a stormwater engineer to see that if the earth around the stream is now saturated with drainage from this new community, the drainage in our community will move slower. Additionally, we are more than concerned about our quality of life, putting up with potential years of ongoing construction as these houses are built one by one, as a narrow dead-end road with heavy pedestrian traffic and no sidewalks, where kids walk the length of the street every day in the road to get to the bus stop, sandwiched in between 2 near-failing intersections. We are sounding the alarm that this is a huge safety risk, and it's not just kids. Our retired and elderly residents walk the length of our street for exercise. While most of us would love new neighbors, we know that there is no safe way to add 190 more daily vehicle trips on this particular street. We've seen too many close calls, too many accidents. We've experienced devastating flooding to our homes. We are the epitome of the existing stable neighborhood that would just be devastated by this development. I don't want to see any of my neighbors seriously injured or killed before someone starts listening. The safety and livelihood of our residents should be paramount, and this plan is incompatible with the existing neighborhood and poses a very real threat to our safety. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Ms. Katz. And now I'd like to call on Mrs. Monica Simonson.
Thank you. My name is Monica Simonson, and I live at 17 Maple Avenue. Thank you for the opportunity to provide community input, which, as has been said, the Baltimore County Master Plan clearly states should be used to help determine both where and how land development will occur. Mr. Alderman has mischaracterized the nature of the community input. I have documentation of emails to county leadership with expressed concerns about the challenges to community input for this specific project, including COVID-related closures and delays, a lack of responsiveness and unreturned emails from the project manager, and the fact that the hearing invitations arrived after the actual hearing date. I'll repeat, a week after the hearing date, I received my invitation due to Postal Service delays. How many of our other neighbors had the same thing and didn't know about the hearing date? I think that it's important to note that while we raised concerns, we didn't understand the nuances of the process and couldn't afford legal counsel from the start. During the administrative law judge hearing, Mr. Alderman's traffic witness repeatedly characterized the projected 42% increase in car traffic as insignificant. However, for those of us who fear for our safety when delivery trucks come barreling down the narrow street without sidewalks, or whose children have almost been hit by a car at the dangerous intersection, we would disagree. The notion of a school bus trying to even fit down Maple to make it down to Davis Farms to turn around is almost laughable. The thought of the bus trying to actually turn out of that intersection is a little ridiculous. My own father was in an accident when he attempted to turn left after waiting 6 minutes to do so in the middle of the afternoon. Mr. Alderman's appeal also specifically challenged the notion that the community schools cannot absorb a new neighborhood full of school-age children. However, Catonsville High School, for example, currently at 1,750 students, is already at 103% capacity and projected to be at 120% capacity when Mrs. Katz's children go there. Those agency representatives have each signed off on a plan for a community they may never have visited, but from their own narrow lens within the scope of their office meets some minimum metric. We believe that it is the role of our elected and appointed county officials to look at the larger picture and connect the dots between those silos, to consider the global impact of the alignment of this development with the overall Baltimore County Master Plan. Lastly, I'd like to push back on the characterization that we are simply resistant to change or intolerant of minor inconveniences. Since the pandemic, our street has experienced an increase in foot and bike traffic as people access the state park in record numbers. We make room for the cars parked up and down Maple Avenue all summer long for the Five Oaks pool goers. We've seen a turnover and welcomed many new families with young children. Change is a part of life. We are, however, advocating to preserve a community that's safe and healthy for years to come.
Thank you so much for your comments. Mr. Coniff, are you there?
Thank you, Madam Chair and board members. I'm Albert Cuniff. I live at 10 Maple Avenue, and I'm certainly not an expert on Baltimore County's master plan, but I do want to raise what I think is a relevant point regarding the letter of the law versus the spirit of the law. As you know, physicians have the Hippocratic oath of underlying, above all, do no harm. I would argue the master plan must have a similar underlying assumption: leave no neighborhood worse off after development. And if we're applying a transect view of land here, and we're saying general versus specific, that's the entire point being missed. Our road is unlike any other in this area. Even the traffic witness that the developer brought in couldn't think of another road when we challenged him. Maple Avenue is a short, dead-end street. It's only 2,200 feet long. It has no curbs, no sidewalks, no alternate ways in or out, and it never will because of other developments and forest. It's only 15 feet across at its narrowest point, as you see in that picture. Unless Mr. Alderman has friends on the school board and the traffic committees there, there's no guarantee the school board would even send a bus up our street. They decide whether to do that. And I agree with Monica that the problem of getting off back onto Frederick Road would possibly make them say, no, let's leave it the way it is. At many spots on our street now, if homeowners who live across from each other simply park in front of their own house, vehicles can't pass. If you add 19 houses to this scenario, we're going to have over 40% increase in housing density and a 50% increase in traffic. The developer estimated conservatively, I think it would be 200 vehicle trips per day. I don't think that takes into account the current Amazon world of multiple deliveries. Because this development's at the very end of our street, every single vehicle would have to traverse the entire length of our road. That's not a good, safe pattern for all the school children, joggers, bicyclists, pet walkers. And believe me, they're there. It's well used. Those who would argue that 19 houses and 200 vehicle trips added to our street would have no significant effect on safety or traffic are overlooking the fact that Maple Avenue will not be widened or improved after this development. Mr. Alderman didn't bring that up either. Other than a short span at the end of the street, directly opposite the development, Maple Avenue would remain only 15 feet wide at certain points with no sidewalks and no curbs. It would be exactly the same. And by the way, 2 accidents have occurred at the intersection of Maple and Frederick in the time since the ALJ's hearing that we're now discussing. So in closing, a huge percentage increase in housing and traffic on a short dead-end road. Is that right? Leaving Maple Avenue in these circumstances after that development surely cannot reflect the spirit of Baltimore County's master plan. Please keep this in mind when you consider the ALJ's decision. And thank you again, Madam Chair and the board members.
Thank you, Mr. Coniff. Right now, Eileen Lehman is our last speaker at this time.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair and members of the planning. We've been residents for 15 years.
No. Can you hear us?
Hello?
No, I don't.
Mrs. Lehman?
Yes.
Go ahead, please speak.
She's looking for your computer.
I'm not connected.
We can hear you, Miss Lehman.
Yeah, thank you so very much, Madam Chair. I'm so sorry. Thank you.
That's okay.
Okay. We're dealing with 3 points, one of which is the sewer status. And it was mentioned that we are at 27 Maple, which is the middle of Maple Avenue. We are the last ones currently on sewer. The proposed development is saying that they were going to put a sewer line in from their development to our sewer, to where the sewer ends. The county has assured us that the old line, which ends at our house, has the capacity to handle the additional volume, even though it is a terracotta pipe installed in 1930. We've been repeatedly told by the county that the sewer pipe will be lined, but that has not occurred. It was last scoped in 2007. In 2011, there was a magnitude 5 earthquake in Virginia, which resulted in seeking shelter and causing damage to our home. Could this sewer line have been damaged? Well, we don't know, but because of the sewer line status, we've had to clean out the sewer from our home to the sewer line. And because of repeated backups, have had to put in check valves. Obvious conclusion, there is a problem already with the sewer line that exists on Maple Avenue. We don't see how connecting an additional 19 homes plus 18 houses that currently exist could be handled. Speaking of those 18 houses that currently exist, and when their septic systems fail, they're going to have to convert to a sewer, which will cost those families, some of whom are on fixed income, upwards of $10,000 to $12,000, because they'll also have to get a grinder pump. This is very, very, very difficult, and reflecting what Al said, and first do no harm. In addition, we want to mention the accidents at Frederick Road, which have also been referenced. The section of Frederick Road that Maple intersects carries the combined traffic of north and south rolling roads. According to the Public Works traffic rating system level of service intersections, Frederick Road and Rolling Road South in February of 2020 was rated an F level of service, which means that the load factor was already at 86 to 100%. That means that traffic is feeding on to Frederick Road going past Maple Avenue. The level of F service intersection would have a moratorium on building permits for it on actually Rolling Road. However, it doesn't affect us, but it should, because we are receiving all that traffic. There is bumper-to-bumper traffic during rush hours, which affects every entry and exit off Maple Avenue. The intersection has...
Miss Lehman.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you very much for your comments. We greatly appreciate it. Taylor Ramsley, you have comments from people that wrote in. Can you please share that?
Yes, Madam Chair. We have 7 comments from the chat box. First, we have Miss Marjorie Wax. She stated, I'm logged on in support of the opposition to the development on the end of Maple Avenue. As a 30-year resident of Catonsville, there have been several developments that have been very beneficial to our community. This, however, is the wrong place. The street is too narrow. The turn and the traffic on Frederick Road make it impossible for any child to walk to school and difficult to even drive. Also, the development would have a very negative impact on the river and the Patapsco State Park. I apologize. Second, we have Mr. Ethan Dublu. I apologize if I pronounced that wrong. He stated, I object to the Davis Farms property because of the traffic issues and it is not consistent with the master plan as identified by the ALJ. Next, we have Carolyn Simonson. She stated, I am scared for my grandkids. I'm fearful as they ride down the narrow road to get to the sidewalks on Frederick and terrified of them getting out of the neighborhood by foot, bike, and eventually as new drivers. Next, we had Michael Simonson. He stated, thank you for considering the entirety of the testimony and evidence that has been presented to date on this issue. The bottom line is that there is just too many houses for this old narrow street. From both an environmental and safety perspective, the infrastructure simply doesn't support it. You have already heard from some of the people in the community, what I will call experts of Maple Avenue. Some of those experts have lived here over 40 years and some only a year or two, but they are all expert residents of the street. They drive down the street as they commute to work. They walk their kids down the street to the bus stop. They see how the street floods on hard rains like yesterday. They see it all every day because this is the place they call home. Thank you again for taking your time and taking into account all of these factors and community inputs to, as stated in the master plan, quote, meet the needs of the present in a responsible manner to keep this home safe. Next, we had Carrie Rosinski. She stated, my name is Carrie Rosinski. I live in 104 Maple Avenue, directly next to the land where the development is supposed to be. I have a 6.5-year-old boy and a 10-month-old girl. We moved here for the school district, but also for the quality of living. We live in an area that we feel is safe, provides good education for our children, and also provides a quiet place for our children to enjoy nature. I am not only very concerned about the school capacities and the disruption of the peace we choose to provide for our children, but my safety concerns are indescribable. The amount of traffic that would come with this development down a road that currently does not allow for 2 cars to pass at the same time is very concerning. The intersection of Frederick Road and Maple Avenue is already difficult to get through. Adding an additional 100 car trips up and down the road will cause such a bottleneck, I don't know how we would ever get anywhere on time. The amount of construction that would need to be done to widen the road would be incredibly disruptive. I don't know how we would be able to continue with our everyday lives. We have such a hard time getting in and out of our driveway right now with one house being built across the road that I can't even fathom this project of this magnitude. All I wanted when I moved here was a quiet place where my children could play in the dirt and get a good education. We were aware that there was a plan to build on this land, but we did not know that the proposed development would destroy the quality of life that we cherish now. Please hear my concerns, not only as a resident of Maple Avenue, but as a mother who will be sharing a fence with this development. I appreciate your time. Next, we had Erin Hager. She stated, please vote against this. This street cannot handle a new development. It is narrow and cannot be widened. This property includes a stream that flooded during the Ellicott City floods and caused a sinkhole adjacent to the property. This simply doesn't make any sense. No one wants this. The community is united against this. Please vote no. Then we had a comment from Maria Sajowski. I apologize if I said that wrong. She stated, I live at 1 Dutton Avenue across from Maple for 35 years. Over the years, there have been numerous accidents at this corner. Drivers fly down Frederick Road at 35 to 50 miles per hour. Adding more houses and drivers at this intersection is very dangerous. Let me check the chat to make sure I got them all. And then we have one last one from Christine Catt. She said, the county should also be reserving sewer capacity for the type of community enhancements planned on Frederick Road, a few miles down the road from Maple Avenue, as detailed in the master plan community enhancement areas. And that's everything, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Ms. Bensley. I greatly appreciate that. So are there any questions from the board right now? And I want to thank all the speakers on this matter. We greatly appreciate your time. If not, I'd like to entertain a motion to schedule a vote on the Davis Farms Master Plan conflict for October 7th, 2021. Can I get a second?
You don't need to do a motion for that. That's just, we'll schedule it for October 7th.
Okay, all right, then that's what we're gonna do. Thank you. Are there any other discussions on this matter?
Madam Chair, if I may, just very briefly, I thank the board for their attention to this issue and to the attorneys for their presentation and to the residents for their passionate presentation. We normally would have scheduled it for September 23rd, but Mr. Alderman had a conflict. That's why we're moving this to the first Thursday of October. And I'd asked if any of the planning board members have any questions about any of the materials that have been shared with you or the report that was provided by Ms. Nugent, to please reach out to us. I know this is a new issue for, if not everybody on the board, almost everybody. So you may have some questions that have come up, but urge all of you to review the materials, but feel free to reach out to us if we can be of any help in working through the various presentations. So thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Lafferty. All right, Ms. Tracy, can you fill us in on legislation recently passed by the County Council following our last meeting?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yes, legislation passed since our last meeting. Bill 70-21, restrictions on parking commercial vehicles in commercial revitalization districts. For the purpose of prohibiting the parking of certain commercial vehicles in commercial revitalization districts, the bill provides specific restrictions in both the Dundalk and Arbutus CRDs. Bill 71-21, zoning regulations, renewable natural gas fueling facility. For the purpose of defining compressed natural gas fueling facility, permitting a compressed natural gas fueling facility in certain areas of the MH zone, subject to certain requirements. Bill 73-21, zoning regulations, uses permitted in the business local zone. For the purpose of permitting certain development tracts to be developed with single-family attached 2/2 condominium dwelling units under certain conditions in the business local parentheses BL zone. Bill 74-21, zoning regulations, building length requirements in the DR zones. For the purpose of exempting certain buildings associated with a school located in a DR zone from compliance with the maximum building length described in the Comprehensive Manual of Development Policies. Bill 75-21, zoning regulations, uses permitted in the business major, parentheses BM zone, for the purpose of permitting certain commercial uses related to the care of and training of animals in the business major BM zone under certain circumstances. That completes the report.
Thank you very much, Ms. Tracy. We greatly appreciate that. Board members, this has been a long meeting. Planning board, thank you so much for all your time on this. And this is the conclusion of our agenda this evening. Do I have a motion to adjourn?
Motion.
Second?
Second.
All right, all in favor?
Aye.
We are done. Thank you
night.
all.